In the summer of 1942, after nearly 3 years of war, Nazi Germany appeared to stand at the height of military power across continental Europe. From Poland, France, and the Balkans to deep inside Soviet territory, the Wehrmacht had advanced with a speed that had once shocked the world. Blitzkrieg was no longer just a tactic. It had become a symbol of the terrifying belief that Hitler's war machine was nearly unstoppable. After the massive early victories of Operation Barbarossa, Hitler believed the Soviet Union now stood only one decisive blow away from collapse. But the Eastern Front was not Western Europe. Distances grew longer, supply lines stretched thin, casualties mounted, and war gradually transformed from lightning encirclements into a colossal war of attrition on a scale never seen before. Rather than committing fully to Moscow again, Hitler turned south, toward the oil fields of the Caucasus and the Volga River, the vital artery of Soviet transport and industry. On that path stood Stalingrad. At first it was a strategic objective, but very quickly the name Stalingrad turned this campaign into something far greater, a political symbol, a test of national will, and a matter of personal prestige for both Hitler and Stalin. An industrial city stretched along the Volga was about to become the place where the two largest war machines on Earth would collide, not to outmaneuver one another, but to grind each other down meter by meter. There, among steel factories, shattered concrete, reinforcements crossing the river under artillery fire, and winter closing in, the war in Europe began to change direction. Because from Stalingrad onward, this was no longer simply the story of how Germany conquered a continent. It gradually became the story of how the Third Reich was broken piece by piece, from the Volga to Kursk, Normandy, Aachen, the Ardennes, and finally Berlin. In the winter of 1941, Nazi Germany's blitzkrieg against Moscow was halted and pushed back. After that defeat, by mid-1942, Adolf Hitler realized that the Soviet Union could not be subdued quickly through a lightning war. The conflict had entered a war of attrition, and to win, Germany had to focus on the enemy's vital resources. Hitler chose the southern front of the Soviet Union, home to vast wheat fields, coal mines, and above all, the rich oil fields of the Caucasus. The strategic goal of the 1942 summer offensive, codenamed Fall Blau, Case Blue, was to seize the oil fields of Maikop, Grozny, and Baku, while cutting off the transport route along the Volga River, the lifeline connecting the southern and northern Soviet territories. In this context, Stalingrad, now Volgograd, a major industrial city on the Volga, became a critical target. It was a strategic transportation hub, the gateway for moving oil from the Caucasus to the north. Capturing Stalingrad would not only allow the Germans to control this vital route, but also secure the northern flank of their advance into the Caucasus. But the city also held symbolic importance. It bore the name of Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. For Hitler, taking Stalingrad would strike a heavy blow to Soviet morale. For the USSR, defending it was a matter of national honor. In the summer of 1942, Hitler mobilized Army Group South, comprising dozens of divisions, to strike toward both the Caucasus and Stalingrad. Under the plan, Army Group A would move into the Caucasus, while Army Group B, including the German 6th Army under Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, the 4th Panzer Army, and allied Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian units, would capture Stalingrad and hold the Volga front. On June 28, 1942, Operation Blau began. German forces swept across the southern steppe, winning a string of victories thanks to their mobility and the power of the Luftwaffe. By July, they had crossed the Don River, seized Voronezh, July 7th, and forced the Soviets to abandon Rostov by the month's end. Deep armored thrusts tore massive gaps in the Red Army's defenses, forcing the Soviets to commit their last reserves to seal the breaches. On July 28th, in this dire situation, Stalin issued order number 227. Not one step back, enforcing iron discipline to prevent any retreat. Every available fighter, from regular troops to civilian militias, was sent to defend Stalingrad. Defensive lines were established at the city's gateway, near a bend of the Don River. The 62nd and 64th Armies held the west bank, backs to the river, determined not to let the enemy cross. With no path of retreat, they had no choice but to hold their ground to the last. On August 23, 1942, the spearhead of Germany's 6th Army reached the outskirts of Stalingrad with the shimmering Volga River visible ahead. That same day, the Luftwaffe unleashed an unprecedented air raid. Over 1,000 tons of bombs were dropped within 24 hours, burning much of the city and turning it into a sea of fire. Tens of thousands of civilians were killed, and the entire city shook under the onslaught. In the following days, relentless carpet bombing flattened large sections of the city, leaving behind a dead city buried under rubble. Yet the ruins became a natural fortress for the Soviet defenders. When German units pushed into the city's edges, they quickly realized Stalingrad would not fall easily. Under the command of General Vasily Chuikov, the Soviet 62nd Army clung to every street and every pile of bricks, ready to trade blood for every meter of ground. The northern and southern suburbs soon fell to the Germans, splitting the Soviet defenders in two. At points where the Germans reached the west bank of the Volga, the Soviets risked crossing the river at night to send reinforcements, one battalion at a time, holding fragile bridgeheads. Among these reinforcements was the 13th Guards Rifle Regiment under Colonel Alexander Rodimtsev, whose men, upon landing, immediately counterattacked to retake key high ground. From that point, the battle became an unprecedented street-fighting nightmare. Both sides fought over individual houses, walls, and even floors. By day, German artillery and aircraft hammered Soviet positions. By night, the Red Army launched surprise counterattacks. Landmarks such as Mamayev Kurgan Hill, Railway Station No. 1, Pavlov's House, and the Tractor, Barricade, and Red October factories changed hands repeatedly. German soldiers called it the Rat War, room by room, cellar to cellar fighting, where the enemy could appear without warning from behind a collapsed wall or on a rooftop. Tanks and heavy artillery were almost useless in the shattered cityscape, and casualties mounted at every street corner. As the Soviet lines were pushed into narrow strips along the river, Field Marshal Paulus ordered a massive assault on the northern industrial sector. German infantry and armor stormed the tractor plant and Barricade factory, engaging in brutal close-quarters combat. Soviet paratroopers made suicidal charges to stop the tanks, while Katyusha rocket batteries from the east bank poured fire in support. The Germans seized part of the factories, pushing Soviet forces back to the water's edge. Some Soviet units, trapped in narrow riverbank pockets only tens of meters from the Volga, held out for days under constant attack. By mid-November 1942, the Germans controlled about 90% of Stalingrad. Only a thin strip along the river remained in Soviet hands, stubborn strongpoints waiting for the right moment to strike back. Paulus did not realize that the long flanks of his 6th Army were held only by Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian units, forces badly weakened and poorly equipped. The Soviet High Command saw this as the enemy's fatal weakness and was secretly concentrating massive forces for a decisive counterstroke, Operation Uranus. At dawn on November 19th, 1942, as a pale sun began to break over the frozen steppe, the sky suddenly shook with the roar of over 3,500 Soviet artillery pieces and mortars. Salvo after salvo thundered into the positions of Romanian troops holding the northern flank of Stalingrad. Mixed in with the crash of heavy guns, was the distinctive shriek of hundreds of Katyusha rocket launchers, unleashing blinding volleys of fire that rained down on the enemy. This was the opening blow of Operation Uranus, a massive combined arms double envelopment. On the northern axis, the Southwestern Front under General Nikolai Vatutin committed 3 full armies, spearheaded by over 1,000 T-34s, KV-1s, and self-propelled guns supported by mechanized infantry. The early morning mist was torn apart by the roar of engines and the grinding of steel tracks over the ice. The defensive lines of Romania's Third Army, lacking effective anti-tank weapons, crumbled almost instantly. Within hours, the Soviet spearheads had driven 25 to 30 kilometers deep, leaving behind burned-out tanks, shattered artillery, and dead littering the trenches. On the morning of November 20th, on Stalingrad's southern flank, the Stalingrad front under General Alexander Yeremenko launched a similar assault against Romania's Fourth Army along the Don River. The attack opened with a storm of fire from thousands of guns and Katyushas, turning defensive positions into a sea of smoke. As the barrage lifted, waves of T-34s and infantry surged forward, smashing through the already faltering defenses. Romanian infantry, armed mostly with rifles and light machine guns, had no chance of stopping the armored tide. From both north and south, the Soviet armored spearheads bypassed isolated pockets of resistance, accelerating across snow-covered fields. Tank columns thundered westward, overrunning supply convoys and severing communications, driving straight into the German rear. On November 23, 1942, at the town of Kalach, the 2 Soviet pincers met. Cheers and gunfire erupted as soldiers from both fronts shook hands amid the freezing wind and drifting smoke. The massive encirclement had closed, trapping all German and Allied forces in the Stalingrad pocket. Around 330,000 troops, the entirety of the German Sixth Army, part of the 4th Panzer Army, and Romanian and Italian units, were now sealed inside a 100-kilometer-wide Kessel. The shock was immediate. German field commanders urged General Friedrich Paulus to break out, while the Soviets were still consolidating their outer ring. In reality, the last days of November were the best, and perhaps only, chance for escape. But from his headquarters in Obersalzberg, Adolf Hitler forbade any withdrawal, ordering Paulus to hold Stalingrad at all costs, as he had previously done at Leningrad and Moscow. That blind confidence was bolstered by Field Marshal Hermann Göring's promise that the Luftwaffe could sustain the encircled army with an air bridge, as it had, to a far lesser extent, at Demyansk earlier in 1942. In reality, the task was impossible. Nearly 500 tons of supplies were needed daily to sustain almost 300,000 men. But even under the best conditions, the Luftwaffe delivered barely 100 tons, less than 1/5 of the requirement. By December, worsening weather and deadly Soviet anti-aircraft fire were shooting down Ju-52 transports in large numbers, and many supply drops fell straight into Soviet hands. Inside the Kessel, German troops were slowly starved. Ammunition and medicine dwindled. Rations dropped to a few hundred grams of stale bread a day. Paulus tightened his defensive lines into the ruined urban terrain, forming a perimeter of about 60 kilometers. According to Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, some 290,000 German and Allied troops, along with more than 10,000 Soviet civilians unable to evacuate, were trapped inside. Beyond the pocket, General Konstantin Rokossovsky of the Don Front established 2 rings, an inner cordon to strangle the trapped forces and an outer cordon to repel any relief attempts. Soon after, German High Command entrusted Field Marshal Manstein, newly appointed to lead the Don Army Group, with launching a counteroffensive, the last faint hope of rescuing Paulus. By mid-December 1942, despite the risk of Soviet offensives erupting across the entire front, Adolf Hitler committed the last of his reserves to save the encircled army at Stalingrad. The plan, codenamed Operation Wintergewitter, Winter Storm, placed overall command in the hands of Field Marshal Erich von Manstein. The main strike force was the 57th Panzer Corps of the 4th Panzer Army, led by General Hermann Hoth, tasked with attacking from the southwest, breaking through the Soviet ring, and driving straight into Stalingrad. Manstein assembled 3 elite panzer and mechanized divisions, supported by several infantry and paratrooper divisions withdrawn from the Caucasus. On December 12, 1942, Hoth's spearhead rolled out from Kotelnikovo, about 160 kilometers southwest of Stalingrad. In the opening days, Hoth's attack achieved surprise. The armored spearhead smashed aside Soviet forward units and advanced rapidly across the snow-covered steppe. After a week of fighting, the 57th Panzer Corps had crossed the Aksai River and reached the approaches to the Mishkova River, now only 50 kilometers from General Friedrich Paulus and the trapped 6th Army. Inside the Stalingrad Kessel, Paulus and his senior officers watched this final glimmer of hope draw closer. They proposed launching a breakout to meet Hoth's advance, but Hitler refused. On December 18, 1942, with Hoth just 40 kilometers from the city, Manstein urgently appealed to Hitler to authorize Paulus to attack outward and link up. Hitler's answer was an uncompromising, hold your ground order. The 6th Army was to remain in place and fight to the last man. Fate struck a cruel blow. Just as the Germans were pouring strength into the relief effort, on December 16, 1942, the Soviets launched Operation Little Saturn, striking the Italian 8th Army along the Don River west of Stalingrad. In less than 2 weeks, the Italian 8th Army was annihilated, creating a gaping hole in the rear of Manstein's relief force. Facing the risk of a Soviet breakthrough and the severing of his own lines of retreat, Manstein halted Operation Wintergewitter. He immediately diverted the 6th Panzer Division at his last reserve to counter the new threat on the western flank. Without reinforcements, Hoth's spearhead froze in place, unable to advance further. Under mounting Soviet counterattacks, German forces pulled back from the Mishkova River by the end of December, ending all hope of rescuing the 6th Army. Operation Winter Storm had failed, leaving over 40,000 German dead on the battlefield, along with nearly all the tanks and artillery committed to the operation. For the 6th Army trapped in Stalingrad, Manstein's withdrawal was nothing short of a death sentence. From late December 1942, even the tenuous air supply dwindled and then stopped altogether. The Soviets systematically seized the improvised airfields used by the Luftwaffe. On January 16, 1943, the Potomnik airfield fell. On January 23rd, Gumrak, the last functioning airstrip inside the pocket, was captured. From then on, the Germans had no supply or evacuation route other than a few desperate airdrops. Inside the city, tens of thousands of troops sank into exhaustion. Hunger, cold, and disease ravaged them in the brutal minus 30 degrees Celsius winter. Deaths from starvation and freezing soon outnumbered those from combat. Nearly 300,000 German soldiers wandered among the rubble searching for shelter, alongside 20,000 wounded groaning in damp cellars without medicine. Food and ammunition were gone. Morale collapsed. Field Marshal Paulus later admitted that his men had slipped rapidly into a state of total exhaustion, both physically and mentally, in the final weeks at Stalingrad. Realizing that the German forces inside the Kessel were exhausted, the Soviet High Command decided to launch the final operation to wipe out the 6th Army. Codenamed Koltso, the Ring, the assault began on the morning of January 10, 1943, after Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus rejected an ultimatum to surrender issued on January 8th. More than 7,000 Soviet guns opened fire in a massive barrage, clearing the way for infantry and tanks to advance. Waves of artillery rained down on German positions. Then T-34s roared forward, crushing defensive strongpoints street by street. Though near collapse, German units resisted fiercely in some areas, but the Red Army adjusted tactics. Strongholds were bypassed and isolated, while the main thrust shifted rapidly to other targets. Within days, German forces were split into smaller pockets and pushed deeper into the city's ruins. By January 17, 1943, after a week of fighting, the Soviets paused to regroup and realign their attack. At this stage, the area under German control had shrunk to less than a quarter of its original size. From far away, Hitler still sent orders to hold to the last man, but such commands over the radio could not change the brutal reality on the ground. On January 22nd, the Soviets resumed their all-out assault. 4 days later, on January 26th, Soviet assault groups linked up in the city center, cutting the Sixth Army into two isolated pockets. The northern sector, under General Karl Strecker, held out in the shattered tractor factory complex. The southern sector, including Paulus's headquarters, entrenched itself in the city center. The final battles raged beneath collapsed buildings, with Soviet troops fighting room to room and calling for the Germans to surrender through loudspeakers. Knowing the situation was hopeless, Paulus requested Hitler's permission to capitulate and save the remaining lives. Instead, on January 30th, 1943, Hitler promoted Paulus to Field Marshal, a gesture laden with the expectation that he commit suicide, as no German field marshal had ever surrendered. Hitler ordered Paulus to fight to the last breath or take his own life, never to fall into the hands of the Bolsheviks. But Paulus, a devout Catholic, refused to kill himself for hollow glory, declaring, "I have no intention of wasting my life for such an empty honor." On the morning of January 31st, 1943, in the cold basement of the ruined Univermag department store in central Stalingrad, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus and his staff stepped forward to surrender to the Red Army. Paulus thus became the first field marshal in Nazi Germany's history to be captured alive, defying Hitler's orders to save the men who still remained. The southern German pocket collapsed almost immediately after this. On February 2nd, 1943, General Strecker and the remnants of the northern pocket also laid down their arms. The last gunshots fell silent over the ashes of Stalingrad. The bloodiest battle in human history had ended after 163 days, with about 91,000 German and Axis troops taken prisoner by the Soviets, including 24 generals. The defeated soldiers, starving, freezing, and many gravely wounded, were ordered to march out of the city's ruins. Heads bowed, they trudged toward Soviet POW camps, beginning long years of harsh captivity in the frozen wastes of Siberia. At his headquarters, upon hearing of Paulus's surrender, Hitler flew into a rage. He shouted to his staff, "How can a man like him surrender to the Bolsheviks after seeing 50 to 60,000 of his own men fight to the death?" To Hitler, the loss at Stalingrad was a reversed Thermopylae. He had hoped the Sixth Army would fight to the death like the legendary 300 Spartans, but it was not to be. The Battle of Stalingrad ended with a resounding Soviet victory and the most devastating defeat suffered by Nazi Germany since the outbreak of World War II. The Sixth Army, once praised by Hitler as the strongest formation in the Wehrmacht, was completely annihilated. Of the roughly 300,000 German and Axis troops trapped in the encirclement, more than 100,000 were killed on the battlefield, and 91,000, including 24 generals, were taken prisoner. In reality, the vast majority of these POWs never returned home. Only about 5,000 to 6,000 survived to be repatriated to Germany after the war, a survival rate of less than 6%. For the Soviet Union, the cost of victory was staggering. Over 1 million Red Army soldiers were killed or wounded in the defense of the city, alongside tens of thousands of civilian deaths. Stalingrad itself was reduced to rubble, a city almost completely leveled, with nothing left but charred walls and shattered foundations. Yet this victory became an immense source of morale for both the Red Army and the Soviet people. It marked the moment when Soviet forces shifted from a defensive posture to an all-out offensive, launching a series of relentless counteroffensives across the entire Eastern Front. In strategic terms, Stalingrad was a decisive turning point. The defeat stripped Hitler's forces of all initiative in the east. From a position of expansion, the Wehrmacht was forced into a defensive stance, continually absorbing the impact of ever larger Soviet offensives in the years that followed. The Soviet triumph at Stalingrad, combined with the Allied victory in North Africa, Tunisia, May 1943, ended the Axis threat of global domination and triggered a major shift in the course of the war. From this point onward, strategic momentum passed entirely to the Allies. 2.5 years later, in May 1945, Nazi Germany was forced to sign an unconditional surrender, closing the darkest chapter in human history. And amid the ruins of Stalingrad, the story of resilience and sacrifice endured, an eternal symbol of the will to fight to the end for freedom and independence. Stalingrad did not end the war on the Eastern Front, but it changed its direction completely. When the German Sixth Army collapsed on the banks of the Volga in early 1943, it was not only hundreds of thousands of German soldiers that disappeared, but also the myth of an invincible Wehrmacht. For the first time, the Blitzkrieg machine that had once swept across Europe was halted, encircled, and crushed in a defeat of enormous symbolic weight. But for Hitler, Stalingrad was not the end. He refused to accept the complete loss of strategic initiative to the Soviet Union. Instead, Berlin prepared for another offensive, one large enough to regain momentum and prove that Germany could still dictate the course of war in the East. That opportunity emerged at Kursk, where the front line had formed a massive salient bulging deep into German defenses. On the map, it appeared to be the perfect target for a classic steel pincer attack from north and south, the kind of operation the Wehrmacht had executed with devastating success in the early years of the war. And so, from the ruins of Stalingrad, Hitler placed his next gamble on Kursk. If Stalingrad was where Germany lost its momentum, then Kursk would decide whether the Third Reich still had the strength to seize the war again, or had begun an irreversible road to collapse. In the summer of 1943, the Eastern Front was bracing for a decisive confrontation, the Battle of Kursk. After the catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad earlier that year, Adolf Hitler was desperate to regain the strategic initiative. He believed that a massive assault on the Kursk salient of Bulge in the Soviet defensive line could change the course of the war. The plan, codenamed Operation Citadel, was drawn up by the German High Command. The goal was to strike the Kursk Bulge from both the north and south, encircling and annihilating Soviet forces concentrated there. If successful, Hitler hoped this would shatter Soviet resistance and force them back onto the defensive once again. The Kursk salient stretched about 550 kilometers across and 150 kilometers deep, between Oriol in the north and Belgorod in the south. Seeing the chance to trap a major Soviet force, Hitler committed nearly all his remaining strength. Around 900,000 troops, 2,700 tanks, 10,000 artillery pieces, and 2,000 aircraft. He concentrated up to 70% of all German tanks and 65% of the Luftwaffe on the Eastern Front for this single battle. New weapons such as the Tiger Y, Panther tanks, and Ferdinand, Elephant, tank destroyers were introduced, with hopes of overwhelming the Soviet T-34s. Hitler demanded victory at all costs, declaring that Kursk would be a warning to the entire world of Nazi Germany's might. But the Soviets had already uncovered the plan. After their triumph at Stalingrad, Soviet intelligence, aided by Allied reports, provided Moscow with clear insight into German intentions at Kursk. On July 2, 1943, Joseph Stalin ordered the Red Army to prepare for the coming offensive. Under Marshals Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky, the Soviets constructed an unprecedented defensive system in depth. 5 successive defensive lines stretching 250 to 300 kilometers, packed with trenches, anti-tank ditches, minefields, and fortified strongpoints. More than 20,000 guns were positioned, including 6,000 anti-tank cannons and hundreds of Katyusha rocket launchers along the likely German breakthrough routes. In the skies, thousands of Soviet aircraft were deployed, most notably the Il-2 Sturmovik ground attack planes, nicknamed flying tanks, ready to strike at German armor from above. Engineers also planted over 500,000 anti-tank mines and about 440,000 anti-personnel mines across the approaches. Altogether, the Soviets massed over 1.3 million troops, more than 3,400 tanks and self-propelled guns, 19,000 artillery pieces and mortars, and about 2,200 combat aircraft in the region. Their determination was clear. Kursk would be turned into a death trap, grinding down the German forces before unleashing a decisive counteroffensive. After multiple delays while waiting for favorable conditions and the arrival of new weapons, Hitler finally fixed the start date of the Kursk offensive for early July 1943. On the night of July 4th into the early hours of July 5th, the Germans launched Operation Citadel. At first, their infantry units carried out probing assaults along the front line to clear the way for the armored spearheads behind. Around 10:30 p.m. on July 4th, in the southern sector of the Kursk salient, German troops quietly seized several key heights, turning them into artillery observation posts. Yet the Soviets were already on full alert. At about 2 a.m. on July 5th, realizing that the enemy was massing for a general offensive, the Voronezh and Central Fronts unleashed a massive preemptive bombardment. Thousands of guns and Katyusha rocket launchers opened fire at once, pouring a storm of shells onto the German assembly areas. This sudden Soviet strike threw the German attack formations into confusion, delaying the advance of army groups south and center by 2 to 3 hours, easing the pressure on the Soviet defenses. At 4:30 a.m. on July 5th, the Battle of Kursk officially erupted. German artillery roared to life, blasting Soviet positions on both the northern and southern flanks of the salient. Immediately afterward, the armored spearheads of the Wehrmacht surged forward. In the south, hundreds of tanks, including Tigers and Panthers, formed wedge-shaped assault groups and hurled themselves at the Soviet lines. Behind them, mechanized infantry and self-propelled guns followed closely, attempting to break through and split the defense in depth. Brutal tank and infantry battles flared up across a front stretching for dozens of kilometers. On the very first day, the Germans tried 4 times to rupture the Soviet lines, but the layered defenses, reinforced by dense minefields, made progress excruciatingly difficult. German engineers struggled to clear safe passages through the mines under relentless Soviet artillery and mortar fire. Many tanks that did enter the cleared lanes hit hidden mines or were struck by well-placed Soviet anti-tank fire, bursting into flames in the open steppe. Smoke and dust blanketed the battlefield, the earth itself shaking under the thunder of thousands of guns and bombs. In the northern sector, the scene was no less ferocious. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge committed the German Ninth Army under General Walter Model and the 2nd Panzer Army to strike southward, aiming for the towns of Poniri and Olkovatka along the Oryol-Kursk axis. This was the junction between the Central Front under Rokossovsky and the Voronezh Front under Vatutin. The Germans hoped to punch through here and encircle the Soviet 13th Army, repeating the kind of encirclement victories they had achieved in 1941. But by 1943, the Red Army was a very different force, battle-hardened, disciplined, and thoroughly prepared. The German thrusts quickly ran into fierce counterattacks from Soviet reserves. At Ponyri, soon nicknamed the Little Stalingrad, of the Kursk front, Soviet infantry regiments and tank brigades dug in stubbornly against the German armored spearheads. Many strong points fought to the last man. One striking example was Captain Igasev's anti-tank gun company north of Ponyri, which held out until its final shell, destroying 19 German tanks and armored vehicles before being wiped out. In savage close-quarter fighting inside the town, tanks blasted each other at point-blank range. Some, crippled with broken tracks, continued firing until destroyed. The small town shook under the inferno its ruins, echoing with explosions, gunfire, and screams, while blackened hulks of German and Soviet tanks lay scattered among shattered fortifications. On the southern flank of the Kursk salient, the Germans under Field Marshal Erich von Manstein at first gained faster momentum. Along the Belgorod-Kursk axis, Army Group South, consisting of the 4th Panzer Army under General Hermann Hoth and Army Detachment Kempf, threw its full strength toward the town of Prokhorovka. This was a vital position, about 87 kilometers southeast of Kursk, guarding the gateway into the Soviet rear. For a full week, from July 5th to 11th, the fighting was relentless. Despite pouring in maximum effort, the Germans managed to advance no more than 35 kilometers at the southern spearhead. Tens of thousands of soldiers from both sides fell for every patch of contested ground. The skies became a battlefield as well, with thousands of aircraft locked in duels for air supremacy. In the early days, the Luftwaffe, using Stuka dive bombers and FW-190 fighters, provided close support to German armor, inflicting heavy losses on the Soviets. Only by July 10th to 11th, when the Red Air Force committed reserves and began regaining part of the air advantage, was the German advance effectively slowed. Still, Manstein resolved to deliver one final steel blow, betting on a concentrated thrust at Prokhorovka, where the elite armored forces of both sides were converging. On July 12, 1943, just outside Prokhorovka, the largest tank battle in history erupted. At dawn, the 4th Panzer Army launched its strongest assault force, the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, with 3 elite divisions, Leibstandarte, Das Reich, and Totenkopf. This was meant to be the decisive strike to smash the Soviet defenses. At the same time, Marshal Ivan Konev's Steppe Front rushed in the 5th Guards Tank Army under General Pavel Rotmistrov, designated as the Soviet Mobile Counterstrike Force. At 8:30 a.m., Rotmistrov ordered over 500 tanks, mostly medium T-34s, with some light T-70s to charge into the flank of the advancing German army. Within minutes, around 1,500 tanks from both sides were locked in combat across a battlefield no larger than a few dozen square kilometers. According to Rotmistrov's account, within minutes of advancing and firing, the echelon formations of the 18th and 29th Guards Tank Corps had pierced into the German lines. Taken by surprise, the German Tigers and Panthers lost their long-range advantage and were drawn into chaotic, close-range brawls with swarms of T-34s. The fields erupted in smoke and fire, the ground trembling under the barrage of shells. Tanks clashed in confusion, blasting away at ranges so close that many never had the chance to turn their turrets before being destroyed. The Tiger's 88mm gun could obliterate a T-34 from hundreds of meters away, but in this swirling melee, many Tigers fell prey to the smaller, more agile Soviet tanks striking from the flanks. Some machines, crippled with broken tracks, stood immobile in the fields, yet kept firing until their hulls were hit and burst into towering flames. Amid the chaos of Prokhorovka, acts of heroism emerged. the crew of Captain Alexander Skripkin from the 181st Tank Brigade, 18th Corps, charged straight into the enemy formation, destroying 2 Tiger tanks before their T-34 was struck by heavy German fire and set ablaze. Skripkin, wounded, was pulled from the burning tank by his comrades. As they retreated, a Tiger fired after them. In a desperate moment, 2 Soviet crewmen, Sergeant Nikolaev and Gunner Chernov, climbed back into the flaming T-34 and drove it directly into the side of the pursuing Tiger. A tremendous explosion ripped through both machines, their sacrifice taking the German tank down with them. On the German side, resistance was equally fierce. Tank gunner Wilhelm Roos recalled how a T-34 suddenly burst into their formation. His commander shouted to fire, and the Soviet tank only came to a halt when it was barely 8 meters away, a gaping hole torn into its turret by an armor-piercing shell. Roos admitted that the Soviet armor had completely overwhelmed the exhausted German troops after days of relentless combat. By the end of July 12th, the German thrust at Prokhorovka had been halted. Unable to advance further, they dug in defensively on the ground they had already seized. The battle ended with devastating losses on both sides. Some 300 to 400 German tanks destroyed, while the Soviets lost as many as 500 tanks and self-propelled guns. Yet, strategically, the Soviets had achieved their goal, stopping the most dangerous German offensive spearhead. The road to Kursk was closed to the Wehrmacht forever. In the aftermath of Prokhorovka, the German High Command grew deeply concerned. At the same time as the tank clash, news arrived that the Western Allies had landed in Sicily on July 10th, threatening Germany's southern flank. Faced with this new crisis, Hitler personally ordered the termination of Operation Citadel before it could achieve anything of significance. On July 16, 1943, the surviving German armored forces at Kursk were ordered to withdraw to their original positions. In reality, after more than a week of savage fighting, the German offensive at Kursk had collapsed in failure. The battlefield was littered with tens of thousands of German dead, alongside hundreds of charred tanks, guns, and aircraft. In just the offensive phase from July 5th to 16th, German losses exceeded 50,000 men and between 400 to 700 tanks and self-propelled guns. Kursk marked the last time in World War II that the German army would have the strength to launch a large-scale strategic offensive on the Eastern Front. From that moment on, the initiative permanently belonged to the Red Army. As soon as they realized the enemy was beginning to falter, the Red Army seized the opportunity to counterattack. In fact, starting on July 12, 1943, while many German units had not yet withdrawn, the entire Eastern Front shifted into the phase of strategic counteroffensive. In the north, the Western and Bryansk fronts under Generals Sokolovsky and Popov launched Operation Kutuzov, striking directly at the Oryol salient, the stronghold held by the Germans above Kursk. The German forces at Oryol, already weakened after days of battle, were forced to fall back and defend desperately. On the very first day, the Soviets broke through the outer defenses, opening the way for their main forces to pour in. After nearly 3 weeks of relentless fighting, on August 5, 1943, the Red Army liberated Oryol, wiping out the German salient there and continuing the advance. By mid-August, Soviet spearheads had pushed 150 kilometers deep, reaching the outskirts of Bryansk, destroying or shattering 15 German divisions along the way. Meanwhile, in the south, the Voronezh and Steppe fronts under Generals Nikolai Vatutin and Ivan Konev launched the Belgorod-Kharkov offensive, a direct continuation of the Battle of Kursk, with the goal of liberating eastern Ukraine. From August 3rd to 23rd, 1943, fierce battles raged around Belgorod and Kharkov. The Germans had fortified themselves within a defensive belt nearly 90 kilometers deep, with trenches, bunkers, and strong points prepared long in advance. Yet the overwhelming Soviet assault shattered the German tactical lines on the very first day, forcing them into a fighting retreat. On August 5th, Belgorod was liberated, and by August 23rd, Kharkov, one of the most important industrial centers of Ukraine, had fallen, with the Soviet red flag flying over the devastated city. In just 3 weeks, the Red Army destroyed or broke apart another 15 German divisions at the Kharkov front, drove the enemy 140 kilometers westward, and expanded the offensive front to 300 kilometers. The victory of the Belgorod-Kharkov offensive marked the full conclusion of the Battle of Kursk, which had raged since early July. From that moment onward, the Soviet Union not only crushed the last major German offensive on the Eastern Front, but also decisively seized the initiative, shifting permanently to full-scale counteroffensives, paving the way toward the liberation of its territory and the ultimate defeat of Nazi Germany in the years that followed. The Battle of Kursk in the summer of 1943 entered history as one of the largest, bloodiest, and most decisive clashes of World War II. It was not merely a battle, but a colossal showdown between the two greatest war machines of the era. Nearly 3 million soldiers, over 8,000 tanks, and 5,000 aircraft from both sides were thrown into the inferno, record-breaking numbers never before seen in human history. Over more than 7 weeks of combat, the cost was staggering. The Soviet Union suffered about 860,000 casualties, with over 1,500 tanks and thousands of guns and aircraft destroyed or damaged. The Germans, too, were bled dry. Around 500,000 officers and soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing. 1,500 tanks, 3,000 artillery pieces, and nearly 3,700 aircraft were lost. 30 German divisions, including 7 elite panzer divisions, were wiped out or crippled beyond combat effectiveness. Kursk, following Stalingrad, delivered a mortal blow to Nazi Germany's expansionist ambitions. After this defeat, Hitler's high command permanently lost the ability to mount large-scale offensives on the Eastern Front. From then on, the Wehrmacht was forced into a defensive posture, reacting passively to the increasingly powerful counterblows of the Red Army. For the Soviet Union, however, Kursk marked a strategic turning point. The Red Army seized the initiative, never relinquished it, and carried it all the way to the raising of the red flag over the Reichstag in Berlin in May 1945. The Battle of Kursk in 1943, with the thunder of thousands of tanks and the blazing fields lit by fire and steel, became an epic of tragedy and heroism etched into human memory. It closed forever the last German hope of victory in the East, and opened the road toward the ultimate triumph of the nations fighting fascism, a victory bought with blood, with tears, and with the limitless sacrifice of millions. Kursk stands as a historic milestone, the moment when the tide of war turned, carrying the world step by step toward final victory in the most brutal conflict of the 20th century. Kursk was not merely the failure of Operation Citadel. It was the moment Germany lost its final chance to regain strategic initiative on the Eastern Front. After the summer of 1943, the Wehrmacht no longer possessed the strength to launch massive offensives on the scale it once had. Instead, it was increasingly drawn into a prolonged war of attrition across Soviet territory, where the Red Army began counterattacking with greater force, broader scale, and steadily pushed Germany's war machine back toward the west. From this point on, the war no longer moved at the pace of blitzkrieg that Hitler had once imposed on Europe. Germany was forced more and more into defense rather than conquest. But while the Wehrmacht was being stretched in the east, another threat was also taking shape in the west. Across the English Channel, Britain, the United States, and the Western Allies had spent years preparing for the largest amphibious invasion in history, a campaign designed to break open Hitler's Atlantic Wall and reopen the Western Front. If Kursk was where Germany lost its chance to reverse the war in the east, Then Normandy would be where Germany was forced to face total war from both directions. On June 6, 1944, when Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, the long-awaited Second Front was finally over. And from that moment on, Nazi Germany was no longer fighting to expand its empire. It was fighting to delay an unavoidable collapse. By 1944, World War II had reached a decisive turning point. Most of continental Europe lay under the iron grip of Nazi Germany, and all roads to victory pointed toward Berlin. But the Allied forces understood that to truly defeat Hitler, they needed to open a second front in Western Europe, a direct blow from the West to relieve pressure on the Soviets advancing from the East. Thus was born the most ambitious amphibious operation in human history, Operation Overlord. The objective was clear: to send hundreds of thousands of troops across the English Channel, land them on the shores of France, and establish a firm beachhead to push into the heart of the continent. After months of intense planning and reconnaissance, the Allied commanders chose Normandy over the more obvious and narrow Pas de Calais, not because it was closer, but because it was less fortified. Normandy offered long, flat beaches ideal for landing craft. It was within range of Allied air support from Britain. Most importantly, it was thinly defended, thanks to one of the most successful deception operations in history, Operation Bodyguard. The ruse convinced Hitler that the real invasion would take place at Calais, forcing him to withhold reinforcements from the actual landing site. Meanwhile, the Germans had spent years constructing the so-called Atlantic Wall, a massive coastal defense system made of bunkers, gun emplacements, minefields, barbed wire, and underwater obstacles, all designed to repel any seaborne assault. But now, that wall was about to face the ultimate test. At dawn on June 5, 1944, after a one-day delay due to rough weather, Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower gave the final go-ahead for Operation Overlord. More than 5,000 warships, transport vessels, and landing craft departed from southern ports in England, setting course across the Channel in the darkness. Overhead, more than 800 transport planes and thousands of fighters, bombers, and gliders soared toward Normandy, carrying not only the hope of a liberated Europe, but also the steel resolve of hundreds of thousands of soldiers stepping into the battle of an entire generation. The mission was to secure a beachhead nearly 80 kilometers wide along the Normandy coast, divided into 5 sectors: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. American forces would land at Utah and Omaha in the west. British and Canadian troops would hit Gold, Juno, and Sword in the east. The vital tasks on D-Day: capture temporary ports, seize key towns, especially the city of Caen in the east, and connect all landing sectors before German reinforcements could mount a counterattack. This wasn't just a military operation, it was a fight for the future of Europe. A fight between the hope of liberation and the brutal machinery of fascist war entrenched just beyond the waves. In the still darkness just after midnight on June 6, 1944, the first Allied troops set foot on French soil, not from the sea, but from the sky. At exactly 12:15 a.m., Pathfinder teams from the U.S. 101st Airborne Division parachuted behind Utah Beach to mark the drop zones for thousands of paratroopers that would follow. 1 minute later, on the left flank of the invasion front, 3 Silent Horsa gliders from Britain's 6th Airborne Division landed near 2 strategic bridges spanning the Orne River and the Caen Canal. In a bold and nearly flawless assault, 181 British airborne troops under Major John Howard stormed the main bridge at Bénouville, seizing it within minutes and stunning the German sentries. That bridge would later be renamed Pegasus in honor of the British airborne emblem. The second bridge at Ranville was also quickly captured. These 2 bridges were crucial to the eastern flank of the invasion, ensuring the Germans couldn't move armored divisions from Caen to counterattack the beach landings. By 12:50 a.m., more British paratroopers from the 6th Airborne were dropping across the Orne, reinforcing their hold. Meanwhile, on the western flank, the first elements of the U.S. 80th Airborne Division were parachuting near Sainte-Mère-Église, a small town that sat astride the main German reinforcement route toward Utah Beach. Between 1 a.m. and 2 a.m., the skies over Normandy thundered with the sound of endless C-47s releasing more than 13,000 American paratroopers into the darkness. Even with extensive training, the moment the jump doors opened overwhelmed many soldiers. Below them was a black void pierced by anti-aircraft tracers and flashes from bombed-out German positions. Strong winds, low visibility, and enemy fire caused many planes to release troops off target. Hundreds of paratroopers were scattered across swamps, forests, and villages. Some landed in marshes, dragged down by heavy gear and waterlogged parachutes. Many drowned before they could cut themselves free. Others got caught in trees, rooftops, or dropped directly into German-held territory. One trooper from the 82nd Airborne found himself hanging from the church steeple in Sainte-Mère-Église, silently suspended above as firefights raged in the streets below. Throughout the German rear, small Allied groups scrambled to regroup. They navigated the unfamiliar terrain, located rally points, and launched hit-and-run raids against enemy strongholds. Sporadic gunfire echoed through the countryside as patrols from both sides stumbled into each other in the chaos of the night. Despite the misdrops and confusion, the courage and adaptability of the Allied paratroopers allowed them to accomplish key objectives. On the eastern flank, British forces established strongholds around Pegasus Bridge and repelled initial German counterattacks. To the west, units of the 82nd Airborne, led by Major General James Gavin, captured the vital La Fière Bridge over the Murderette River, though they would hold it under siege for days amid intense German assaults. By 4 a.m., the 3rd Battalion of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment had liberated Sainte-Mère-Église, believed to be the first French town freed on D-Day. Further east, elements of the 101st Airborne had secured key crossroads and small bridges near Utah Beach, clearing the way for reinforcements arriving from the sea. By first light, more than 18,000 Allied paratroopers from the US, UK, and Canada were on French soil. They controlled most of their high-priority targets on both flanks of the beachhead. The eastern flank was secured at Pegasus Bridge, and the western approaches were open. Despite heavy losses, the airborne troops had achieved their mission: to pave the way for the main invasion force in what would become the largest amphibious assault in history. After the airborne forces completed their opening phase under cover of darkness, the battle moved into its decisive stage. As dawn began to break over the English Channel, an unprecedented sight unfolded off the coast of Normandy. An enormous Allied armada stretched across the horizon, anchoring just a few dozen nautical miles from shore in preparation for the main assault. More than 5,000 ships of various types, including battleships, cruisers, destroyers, transports, and landing craft, were organized into task forces, each assigned to one of the 5 landing sectors: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. Between 3 a.m. and 5 a.m., the warships took up formation and began lowering thousands of landing craft into the choppy waters. From the decks of transport ships, tens of thousands of infantrymen descended rope ladders into rocking LCVPs. Many turned pale from seasickness, vomited, or trembled from cold and anticipation. For these men, it was a one-way journey, and they all knew it. As the sky lightened, the first waves of preparatory bombardment began. At exactly 5:30 a.m., the order to open fire was given. A thunderous chorus erupted as Allied warships, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers simultaneously unleashed their naval guns on German fortifications lining the beaches of Normandy. From offshore, massive shells screamed through the sky and crashed into bunkers, pillboxes, artillery emplacements, and machine gun nests. Plumes of smoke and flame erupted across the coastline, some reaching tens of meters high. Overhead, waves of Allied bombers approached from England, dropping payloads on inland German defenses and beach targets. However, many bomber pilots, fearing they might hit friendly troops approaching the shoreline, dropped their bombs farther inland, leaving some coastal defenses largely intact, particularly at Omaha Beach. On the German side, though high alert had been issued, many units failed to respond in time. Some officers still believed this was a diversionary attack. Nonetheless, coastal batteries soon began returning fire. At Longue-sur-Mer, a fortified position between Omaha and Gold Beaches, 4 155mm guns opened fire at 5:37 a.m., nearly striking several Allied vessels before being suppressed by British naval fire. While artillery duels raged, the first assault units began approaching the beaches. On the far eastern flank, the British 4th Commando Brigade, accompanied by Free French units, made their way toward the Orne River estuary. They would be the first to storm Sword Beach. At 5:30 a.m., these vanguard troops climbed aboard their landing craft, gripping their rifles tightly, and began the final 7-kilometer run from the motherships to the shoreline. At the same time, a critical mishap occurred off the coast of Omaha. Due to rough seas and limited visibility, several LCTs released their amphibious Sherman DD tanks too far from shore. The result was disastrous. Most of the 32 tanks from the 741st Tank Battalion were swallowed by the waves before they could reach land. Only a few made it onto the beach, leaving the American infantry at Omaha to begin their assault with little to no armored support, just as they were about to face one of the most heavily defended beaches of the entire invasion. 6:30 a.m. H hour. The moment circled on every map, etched into every order. At exactly 6:30 in the morning, the first assault waves of Allied troops hit the shores of Normandy, launching the largest amphibious invasion in history. At Utah Beach, the westernmost sector, the U.S. 4th Infantry Division landed with relatively little resistance. Although strong winds and currents had pushed the landing craft almost 2 kilometers off course, what seemed like a mistake became a stroke of fortune. The new landing zone had virtually no fortified German resistance. Most of the defenders from the German 919th Regiment, 709th Division, were stationed inland, too far to react in time. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., the only general to land in the first wave, made a decisive call. "We'll start the war from right here." Without attempting to reorganize, he ordered his troops to advance from the new position. Thanks to that bold move, American forces surged forward, overwhelming scattered German positions and quickly pushing off the beach. Within hours, elements of the 4th Division had linked up with paratroopers from the 101st Airborne waiting at key crossroads inland, establishing a firm bridgehead at Utah. But over at Omaha Beach, fronting the villages of Vierville-sur-Mer and Colleville, the scene was vastly different. Here, the Americans encountered the most ferocious resistance on the entire front. Despite a 30-minute preparatory naval bombardment, many German bunkers and pillboxes remained intact. The beach was defended by Germany's 352nd Infantry Division, a battle-hardened unit entrenched in interlocking fields of fire from the bluffs above. As soon as the LCVPs lowered their ramps, Omaha erupted into chaos. Mortars rained down from the cliffs, and MG-42 machine guns swept the beach with deadly crossfire. The first wave of American troops had nowhere to hide. Many were cut down before even leaving the boats. Others drowned beneath the weight of their gear. Within minutes, casualties surged into the hundreds. The shoreline was strewn with the dead and wounded, tangled in barbed wire, steel obstacles, and jagged beach defenses. Surviving officers scrambled to regroup, using shell craters and sand mounds as cover to inch forward. The beach echoed with gunfire, shouted orders and cries for help, all blending into a nightmarish soundscape. Later estimates confirmed that around 2,000 Allied troops were killed at Omaha alone, making it the bloodiest landing of D-Day. While Americans fought for survival on their beaches, British and Canadian forces launched their own assaults to the east. At 7 a.m., the British 3rd Infantry Division landed at Sword Beach, stretching from Ouistreham to Lyon-sur-Mer. Defended by the German 736th Regiment, 716th Infantry Division, the beach was lined with strong points hidden among seaside buildings and gun nests at Rivabella. Although German numbers were thin, their resistance was stubborn. With support from specialized tanks like Sherman DDs, AVREs, and rocket-equipped landing craft, the British gradually dismantled the defenses and began pushing inland. At 7:25 a.m., troops from Britain's 50th Division landed at Gold Beach, fronting Arromanches and La Rivière. The terrain here was rugged. Rocky outcrops and high bluffs gave defenders from the German 916th Regiment ideal firing positions. The first British wave drifted slightly east and ran into heavy fire from La Rivière and a devastating 88mm gun hidden on the flank. Using their so-called funny tanks, flamethrowers, mine flails, and bridge layers, the British slowly cleared the strong points. By midday, Gold Beach was largely under control, and British units began pushing toward Bayeux. At 7:45 a.m., the Canadian 3rd Infantry Division arrived at Juno Beach, near Courseulles-sur-Mer. Rough seas sank several amphibious tanks meant to support the assault, forcing Canadian infantry to advance nearly unaided against wire obstacles and concentrated German fire from the 736th and 716th Regiments. Casualties in the first hour were extremely high, higher than Omaha proportionally per unit scale. Still, with grit and reinforcements including Churchill tanks, the Canadians managed to overrun the strong points and advance into the town of Courseulles. Across every beach, D-Day was marked not just by scale, but by raw courage. At Omaha, amidst the chaos, Brigadier General Norman Cota, deputy commander of the U.S. 29th Division, led from the front, shouting, "Rangers, lead the way!" He rallied shattered units and drove them forward. Under his command, soldiers began breaking through minefields and barbed wire, crawling up narrow gullies toward the bluffs. Meanwhile, on Omaha's western flank, at 7:10 a.m., 250 elite U.S. Rangers from the 2nd Ranger Battalion, led by Lieutenant Colonel James Rudder, landed at Point du Hoc, a 100-foot cliff between Omaha and Utah, believed to house German heavy artillery capable of threatening both beaches. Despite heavy surf and gunfire, the Rangers scaled the cliffs using ropes and grappling hooks. At the top, they discovered the artillery had been moved inland. Only decoy logs remained. But they soon located and destroyed the real guns hidden in nearby orchards. The Rangers then held the cliff for 2 full days, repelling relentless German counterattacks until reinforcements arrived. By midday on June 6th, the situation across the Normandy beaches had begun to take shape. At Utah Beach, the U.S. 4th Infantry Division successfully linked up with elements of the 101st Airborne, and together they advanced inland to seize the town of Poupeville, securing it before early afternoon. Behind them, waves of American reinforcements, artillery, engineers, logistics, continued pouring ashore, expanding the beachhead and pushing deeper into the Cottonton Peninsula. At Omaha, after the brutal carnage of the morning, American troops gradually pushed the Germans off key defensive positions. Small, determined assault teams scaled the cliffs, flanked the bunkers, and used grenades and flamethrowers to suppress the defenders from the rear. By early afternoon, the main resistance points along Omaha had been neutralized. From offshore, General Omar Bradley received the long-awaited message. Troops are off the beach and moving up the bluff. It was a hard-won signal, but Omaha had held. On the eastern flank, British forces at Sword Beach pushed nearly 8 kilometers inland, linking up with the 6th Airborne Division at Pegasus Bridge at exactly noon. just as planned. There, exhausted paratroopers who had defended the crossing through the night shook hands with troops arriving from the sea. Leading the relief force was Lord Lovett, commander of the 1st Special Service Brigade, who had marched his men directly from Sword to the bridge. The link-up at Pegasus became a symbolic moment, representing the initial Allied success along the eastern flank. Throughout D-Day, the German command structure remained paralyzed. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, in charge of Army Group B and coastal defenses, was away in Germany on leave. In Paris, Field Marshal von Rundstedt initially believed the landings were a diversion and hesitated to act decisively. It wasn't until the afternoon that the Germans launched their first major counterattack. From the south, the 21st Panzer Division was ordered to strike between Sword and Juno beaches in an effort to split the British and Canadian forces. Around 3 p.m., a column of approximately 50 German tanks emerged near the village of Perriers and advanced rapidly toward the coast. Some tanks even slipped through the gap between the two beaches, reaching the Orne River, where they briefly threatened Allied supply units near the shoreline. However, the bold thrust lacked coordination. Under withering fire from British anti-tank guns and repeated Allied airstrikes, the Panzer column stalled. By late afternoon, surviving tanks withdrew to their original positions. Though the counterattack failed to break the beachhead, it delayed the British advance toward Caen, the primary objective of the 3rd Infantry Division, which remained out of reach by nightfall. Across the entire front, Allied commanders now faced tough decisions, whether to push forward or consolidate gains for the night. On the western flank, General J. Lawton Collins, commanding 7th Corps, was satisfied with Utah's progress, having penetrated 6 to 8 kilometers inland. He ordered his troops to dig in for the night while preparing for the upcoming push toward the port of Cherbourg. In contrast, progress from Omaha remained slow. The bocage country, dense hedgerows and sunken lanes, created natural defensive lines for the Germans. By evening, U.S. forces had only just liberated coastal villages such as Colville and Saint-Laurent, reaching the outskirts of Formigny. British and Canadian troops moved faster across the flatter terrain. Canadian forces at Juno advanced nearly 12 kilometers, making them the deepest Allied penetration on D-Day. They seized Carpiquet airfield near Caen, but halted due to lack of flank support. Meanwhile, British forces from Gold Beach linked up with the Canadians at Juno by dusk, creating a continuous beachhead nearly 20 kilometers wide across the eastern sector. However, a gap still remained between the Americans at Omaha and the British at Gold. Key towns like Bayeux, Carentan, and Saint-Lô, all crucial to linking the fronts, remained under German control. Despite that, the Allies achieved important strategic objectives. At Gold Beach, British forces liberated Arromanches, where they would later install the Mulberry Harbor, a massive artificial port that would become vital for Allied logistics in the weeks to come. At Sword Beach, though Caen remained in German hands, the British had secured coastal villages and anchored their right flank firmly thanks to the reunion with the airborne bridgehead. As night fell over the English Channel, the largest amphibious invasion in human history came to the end of its first day. After hours of brutal combat, the Allied forces had held their ground on French soil. The beaches of Normandy, once engulfed in smoke, chaos, and gunfire, were now scenes of devastation, silence, and exhaustion. Hundreds of scorched landing craft lay wrecked along the shoreline. Burned-out vehicles were scattered across the sand, tangled in barbed wire, iron obstacles, and debris. Next to the fallen, medics and field nurses rushed to treat the wounded. In the dim glow of flashlights, surviving soldiers dug shallow trenches, stacked ammunition and rationed supplies unloaded from ships offshore. Gunfire still crackled sporadically in the distance as isolated German strongpoints were mopped up, but overall, the intensity of battle had eased. One thing was clear by dusk: the Allies had secured a foothold on the continent. On the German side, Adolf Hitler finally accepted that this was not a diversion. It was the long-feared invasion of the Western Front. But by then, it was too late. German command had been in disarray all day. Reinforcements were hastily mobilized through the night of June 6th, tasked with defending key towns deeper inland like Carentan, Bayeux, Saint-Lô, and Caen, in hopes of sealing the gaps between the Allied beachheads in the days to come. Still, the German objective for the night was no longer to repel. It was to survive. The goal of throwing the Allies back into the sea on the first day had already failed. June 6, 1944 ended in a decisive strategic victory for the Allies. The cost was staggering. Over 10,000 Allied casualties, including more than 4,400 confirmed dead. But the mission had succeeded. The beachhead was real, it was stable, and it was growing. That day, more than 155,000 Allied troops, American, British, Canadian, along with thousands of vehicles, tanks, and artillery pieces, had landed safely on the shores of Normandy. The opening phase of Operation Overlord was complete, and a corridor into Europe had been breached. That evening, many soldiers fell asleep right where they had fought. Some slumped over their rifles, others lay atop their backpacks in shallow pits dug hurriedly into the sand. Their eyes stung from gunpowder, their hands still clenched around their weapons. In their hearts was a storm of emotion, the ache of loss, the weight of survival, and the quiet pride of knowing they had done what the world needed them to do. On the distant horizon, flares still pulsed above the surf. But the sky over Normandy was no longer choked with death. The worst of the day's carnage had passed. And yet, the war was far from over. Ahead lay counterattacks, burning hedgerows, shattered villages, and cemeteries not yet dug. But whatever came next, June 6, 1944, D-Day, had already carved its place in history. Not just as a military operation, but as a profound testament to human courage, sacrifice, and the pursuit of freedom. It marked a turning point in World War II, a day when the tide began to turn, and the liberation of Western Europe truly began. In the years that followed, the world would not forget the price paid on those blood-stained sands. The beaches where thousands fell would forever be remembered, not by their code names, but by a title that speaks to what was won there: the beaches of freedom. Normandy did not end on the beaches of June 6, 1944. The landings were only the beginning, the first breach in Hitler's Atlantic Wall. Once Allied forces secured a foothold on the coast of France, they still had to break through the dense bocage defenses, withstand fierce German counterattacks, and transform a fragile beachhead into a true offensive across Western Europe. For weeks, the battle in Normandy became a brutal war of attrition fought through fields, roads, and hedgerows. But as Allied air power, logistics, and industrial strength began to fully assert themselves, German defenses gradually cracked. After Operation Cobra, German lines were broken, Paris was liberated, and the war in Western Europe shifted from invasion to a full-scale advance toward Germany's borders. By the autumn of 1944, the question was no longer whether the Allies could return to Europe. It was when the war would enter Germany itself. That point was Aachen. Situated near Germany's western frontier and tied to the defenses of the Siegfried Line, Aachen became the first major German city to directly face the Allied advance. If Normandy blew open the door to Western Europe, then Aachen was the moment the war officially knocked on Germany's own front door. In early autumn 1944, after sweeping the Germans out of France, Allied forces reached the western border of Germany. Ahead of them stood the formidable Siegfried Line, a massive wall of bunkers, pillboxes, and minefields stretching for hundreds of kilometers. Sitting right on that line was Aachen, the ancient capital of Emperor Charlemagne, a city deeply rooted in German identity, and now the first German city threatened with invasion in World War II. Though Aachen had little military value, Hitler ordered it to be defended at all costs. The city was quickly absorbed into the Siegfried Line's network of fortifications, transformed into a fortress guarding the gateway to the Ruhr industrial heartland. By mid-September 1944, as U.S. troops approached the outskirts, the Germans referred to the clashes as the First Battle of Aachen. The city was held by General Gerhard von Schwerin's 116th Panzer Division. Realizing the situation was hopeless, von Schwerin secretly drafted a surrender letter to spare the civilians. But before he could send it, Hitler ordered a counterattack. Schwerin obeyed, launching his Panzer Grenadiers in a desperate strike that failed. His letter fell into Hitler's hands. The furious Führer had him arrested and replaced with Colonel Gerhard Wilk. From that moment, Aachen's fate was sealed. It would not surrender. It would burn. Through mid-September, the U.S. 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, pushed closer, tightening the encirclement from the north, west, and south. Yet by late September, the offensive stalled as supplies thinned and priority shifted to Operation Market Garden in the Netherlands. The pause allowed Germany to reinforce its defenses, bringing troop strength around Aachen to over 20,000 men, including heavy tank battalions and hastily trained Volksgrenadier divisions. Poorly prepared but shielded by the city's concrete maze of bunkers and trenches, they were ready to fight to the death. On the Allied side, preparations resumed. The 19th Corps under General Charles Corlett would strike from the north, while 7th Corps under General Joseph Collins attacked from the south, led by the Old Hickory 30th Infantry Division and the Big Red One. The plan: encircle Aachen, cut it off, and only then send in a smaller force to finish the job. At dawn on October 2nd, 1944, the skies over western Germany thundered with the roar of aircraft engines. Hundreds of dark specks appeared through the gray clouds, 450 American bombers heading straight for Aachen. In the opening strike of the offensive, they unloaded thousands of tons of bombs, shaking the German defense line to its core. But the thick smoke from the preparatory artillery barrage blinded the bombardiers. Not a single bunker was hit directly. As soon as the bombing ended, Allied artillery unleashed another storm. In just a few hours, nearly 19,000 shells from 372 heavy guns rained down on the German front. The ground trembled. The sky glowed orange with fire. It was the most violent bombardment on German soil since 1939. The Americans believed the Aachen defenses were crumbling, but in truth, the nightmare had only begun. From the north, the U.S. 30th Infantry Division crossed the Worm River that same morning and immediately met a wall of steel. Every bunker was a fortress on its own, taking up to 30 minutes of fierce fighting to destroy, even with artillery support. The Americans quickly realized that unless they seized the next position fast, surviving German troops would counterattack and retake what had just been lost. Casualties mounted at an alarming rate. One company lost 87 men in just an hour. Another, nearly wiped out, was caught in a single German artillery strike. Yet, through overwhelming firepower and determination, the Americans pressed on, crawling through mud, closing in on each bunker with flamethrowers and satchel charges. By afternoon, one column of the 30th Division broke through the first defensive belt and entered the town of Pallenberg on Aachen's outskirts. The fighting there devolved into brutal, close-quarter combat. Soldiers hurling grenades through windows, storming stairwells, even grappling hand-to-hand in darkened rooms. Amid the chaos, acts of raw heroism shone through. Private Harold G. Kiner of the 30th Division threw himself onto a live grenade to save his squad mates, sacrificing his life and earning the Medal of Honor. Meanwhile, across the Worm in the village of Rimberg, American troops faced a medieval castle turned into a fortress. The bridge couldn't bear the weight of tanks, forcing infantry to storm the stronghold alone, room by room, against entrenched defenders. By nightfall, the The 30th Division reported 50 enemy bunkers destroyed, many by flanking and attacking from the rear, where the concrete walls were weakest. A diversionary attack by the U.S. 29th Division on the flank further confused the Germans, allowing the main force to advance more easily at Pallenberg. That night, Germany countered with its 902nd Assault Gun Battalion, equipped with Sturmgeschütz self-propelled guns. But Allied artillery intercepted the formation before it could fully deploy, crushing the attack before it began. The next morning, October 3rd, American Sherman tanks and M12 self-propelled guns crossed the river, firing point-blank into the remaining bunkers. With their support, infantry captured Rimberg and secured a foothold on the eastern bank. Yet progress soon slowed under a wave of German counterattacks. In Übach, U.S. tanks punched deep into town but were forced back by heavy artillery fire. The Germans launched several desperate assaults to retake the town, but each was shattered by American fire. By the end of the second day, the 30th Division held the bridgehead, at the cost of 300 casualties in just 48 hours. In the following days, the Germans kept counterattacking. Each push was repelled, but the constant pressure slowed the American advance. On October 4th, U.S. troops seized only a few small villages, Haverdor and Beggendorf, while total casualties reached nearly 1,800 after 3 days of fighting. On October 5th, the 119th Regiment captured the Merkstein-Herbach area, improving the U.S. position slightly. The next day, the Germans counterattacked Übach again and failed again. Their forces were wearing thin, tanks running out, manpower dwindling. In a last-ditch effort, they threw every remaining gun and even a handful of Luftwaffe planes into battle. But the bombing runs did little. Field Marshal Walter Model, commander of Army Group B, rushed one of his last Tiger tank detachments to the town of Alsdorf, hoping to seal the breach in Aachen's northern defenses. But hour by hour, it was becoming clear. Even the steel wall of Germany was beginning to crack. October 8, 1944. After more than a week of brutal fighting, the skies over western Germany thundered once again, this time with the roar of German engines. At dawn, the Wehrmacht launched its largest counterattack since the start of the battle. From behind the shattered tree lines around Aachen, an infantry regiment, Assault Battalion Number 1, a detachment of the 108th Panzer Brigade, and roughly 40 armored vehicles surged forward. Their mission, to smash into the flank of the U.S. 31st Infantry Division, split the American advance, and regain control of the northern front. American artillery struck first, shredding the German columns as they advanced, but the attackers pressed on through fire and smoke. On the left, German troops pushed deep into the U.S. line, cutting off an American platoon. On the right, they reached a road junction north of Alsdorf. In the nearby village of Mariadorf, a platoon of Sherman tanks supporting infantry suddenly came under ambush from behind. The narrow streets erupted in chaos as tanks from both sides fought at point-blank range. After a desperate struggle, the Americans managed to repel the assault. Meanwhile, 2 German Sturmgeschütz, 4 assault guns, and a group of stormtroops infiltrated the town of Alsdorf, creating havoc in the American rear. But the U.S. soldiers counterattacked swiftly, forcing the German tanks to retreat to their starting line. The October 8th counteroffensive, though daring, failed to turn the tide. The Americans suffered additional casualties and temporarily paused their advance, but the northern front of Aachen still held firm. Realizing how dire the situation had become, the German High Command rushed the 3rd Panzergrenadier Division, a key reserve unit, to reinforce Aachen. Hitler then committed one of his last strategic cards, the 1st SS Panzer Corps, including the reconstituted 116th Panzer Division and the elite SS 101st Heavy Tank Battalion, equipped with Tiger tanks from the famed Leibstandarte Division. The Reich intended to defend Aachen to the last man, no matter the cost. Meanwhile, on the southern front, the U.S. 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, launched its own attack that same day to close the encirclement from below. Under a curtain of heavy artillery fire, American troops stormed the town of Verlautenheide and nearby hill 231, which they nicknamed Crucifix Hill, within hours. There, Captain Bobby E. Brown of the 18th Infantry Regiment crawled up alone, placing explosive charges to destroy 3 German bunkers one by one. Wounded but unyielding, he led his men to capture the high ground, an act of valor that earned him the Medal of Honor. By October 10th, the division had cleared the southern outskirts of Aachen and prepared to link up with the northern forces. The Germans, desperate to reclaim Crucifix Hill, launched furious counterattacks through the night. The battle turned into a bloodbath. More than 40 German soldiers were killed, 35 captured, their bodies scattered across the slope. Despite these relentless assaults, the Big Red One held firm on every key position surrounding the city. After over a week of relentless combat, the American pincers had almost closed around Aachen. From north to south, the 2 attacking arms were separated by only a few kilometers. Seeing no way out, Major General Clarence Hübner, commander of the 1st Infantry Division, sent an ultimatum to Colonel Gerhard Wilk, the German commander inside the city: surrender immediately or face total destruction. Wilk, loyal to Hitler's orders, refused coldly. No surrender. Hours later, Hübner made good on his threat. On October 11th, over 5,000 shells, the equivalent of 150 tons of explosives, rained down on Aachen. The ground shook, windows shattered, and American dive bombers screamed overhead, dropping wave after wave of bombs onto the burning city. Whole neighborhoods collapsed into rubble. From miles away, black smoke could be seen rising over the ancient capital of Charlemagne. And in that rising haze, the battle for Aachen, the fiercest fight ever waged on German soil, had begun. From October 11th to 12th, 1944, as the Allied noose around Aachen tightened, German forces outside the city were still desperately trying to break through and rescue the garrison. On the night of October 10th to 11th, in the northern town of Badenburg, German troops secretly turned civilian basements into fortified anti-tank nests. When American infantry entered the town the next morning, they were met by a storm of fire from hidden gun ports, pinned down in the narrow streets. Badenburg became a deadly maze, forcing U.S. troops to pull back and call in artillery, which leveled the town to destroy the underground resistance. On October 12th, the Germans launched a major counterattack against the U.S. 30th Infantry Division in the north, hoping to push back the tightening ring. Chaos erupted as German armor poured into the village of Burg. One Panzer IV was blown apart by a Sherman tank on the main street. Another took a hit and fled. But the lone Sherman soon found itself surrounded by multiple enemy tanks. Just as it seemed doomed, a platoon from the U.S. 2nd Armored Division charged into the fight, engaging in a furious 3-hour tank duel that ended with the remaining German armor burning in the streets. Though they repelled the assault, the 30th Division was exhausted. Commanders ordered them to shift to the defensive, but higher command refused to let the advance stop. The northern and southern pincers had to meet as planned. 2 fresh battalions from the 29th Division were sent in to reinforce the weary 30th. Meanwhile, in the south, the Germans hurled 2 full infantry regiments in a suicidal counterattack to retake Crucifix Hill, the key high ground recently captured by the U.S. 1st Infantry Division. With direct artillery fire and sheer determination, they managed to storm the summit, briefly pushing the Americans off. But by day's end, the Big Red One counterattacked, recapturing the hill and annihilating both German regiments. The slopes of Crucifix Hill were littered with bodies and shattered weapons, a grisly monument to a battle fought to the last man. Between October 11th and 13th, Allied aircraft continued targeted bombing runs over Aachen, striking resistance pockets near the American front lines to aid the infantry. On October 14th, the 26th Infantry Regiment of the 1st Division received orders to begin advancing through the industrial outskirts, the final approach to the city itself. But the Germans struck back again on October 15th, launching one of their last major counteroffensives. Waves of Panzer and Tiger tanks smashed into the U.S. 1st Division, momentarily breaching the line and spreading panic among the infantry. Then Allied artillery and air strikes answered, a deluge of fire that tore apart the German formation before it could exploit the breakthrough. By October 16th, the remnants of the German 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division had been bled dry. Their final scattered assaults that day were crushed almost instantly, leaving burning tanks and broken soldiers across the fields outside Aachen. Meanwhile, from October 13th to 16th, the 30th Infantry Division fought inch by inch in the north, stripping away the last layers of German defense to link up with the southern force. The fiercest fighting centered on the village of Würselen, a narrow corridor that allowed only a single line of advance, making it ideal for German defense. Artillery rained down, houses turned into bunkers, and German tanks hid among the ruins, waiting to ambush U.S. troops at point-blank range. Even with constant air support, the Americans advanced painfully slowly. Seeing the stalemate, Colonel S.L. Hobbs, commander of the 30th Division, made a bold move. He redirected 2 battalions to flank the German position instead of attacking head-on. The gamble worked, the line cracked, and on October 16, 1944, the northern and southern pincers finally met. After 2 relentless weeks of fighting, the ring around Aachen was sealed. Roughly 5,000 German troops remained trapped inside, low on ammunition, food, and hope. Outside, exhausted American soldiers stood among the smoking ruins, bracing for the next and bloodiest phase, the street-by-street battle for Aachen itself. By this point, the U.S. 19th Corps had suffered over 2,400 casualties, more than 2/3 of them from the 30th Division. The Germans had lost around 5,000 men killed or wounded, including 600 in their final, desperate counterattacks on October 15th to 16th. Both sides had reached the breaking point, where victory and annihilation were separated by only a breath. Inside Aachen, after the devastating artillery barrage of October 11th, entire neighborhoods had been reduced to rubble. Streets that once echoed with church bells and tram wheels now lay buried under smoke, dust, and blood. Yet beneath the ruins, in the dark basements and underground tunnels, German soldiers still clung to their posts, scattered in small pockets across the shattered city, refusing to surrender. General Clarence Hübner, commander of the U.S. 1st Infantry Division, knew that most of his forces had to remain outside to maintain the encirclement and fend off counterattacks. Thus, the assault on the inner city fell to a relatively small force, the 26th Infantry Regiment, led by Colonel John Seitz, with just 2 battalions, the 2nd and 3rd, a few Sherman tanks, and a single 155mm howitzer for direct fire support. Opposing them were about 5,000 German defenders, remnants of the Wehrmacht, Luftwaffe, and police units hastily pressed into service. They lacked armor and training, but had one decisive advantage: the city itself. Aachen's narrow medieval streets, thick stone walls, and underground network of tunnels had turned the city into a natural fortress. On October 13th, the 26th Regiment began its push from the industrial outskirts in the east. Almost immediately, the Americans encountered an eerie, deadly form of resistance. The enemy was attacking from below. German troops used the city's sewer tunnels to move unseen, emerging behind American patrols and ambushing them from basements or even through manholes. Whole squads vanished in sudden bursts of gunfire from unseen angles. Every intersection, every building now required a cautious inspection. Every doorway, every drain could hide death. Sherman tanks fared little better. The narrow streets and piles of rubble slowed them to a crawl. Each time a tank turned a corner, a hidden anti-tank gun or Panzerfaust rocket screamed out from a shattered window, striking its flank. Several Shermans burned where they stood, black smoke curling into the gray October sky. Progress was measured not in meters, but in houses captured. The Germans fought like phantoms. They used tunnels and sewers to appear and disappear at will, striking from behind and then melting underground. Even when Allied bombers pounded the city above, German troops moved below the surface, emerging unexpectedly behind American lines. The battle for Aachen became a ghostly urban war. No clear front lines, only hundreds of isolated strong points hidden within the ruins. Realizing the resistance would not break easily, Hübner called for reinforcements. He requested an armored battalion from the 3rd Armored Division. Soon, the 3rd Battalion of the 33rd Armored Regiment, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Samuel M. Hogan, entered the city. Known as Task Force Hogan, their mission was to attack from the north, seize the towering Lausberg Hill overlooking Aachen, and crush the German headquarters located in the Quellenhof Hotel below it. Controlling Lausberg meant controlling the entire city. By October 18th, after days of grueling combat, American troops had surrounded the German command center. The 3rd Battalion of the 26th Regiment received the order to storm the Quellenhof. Throughout the day, American tanks and artillery blasted the hotel point blank. Walls crumbled, windows shattered, yet in the basement, German soldiers still fought on, entrenched in despair. That night, the Germans made one last daring move. Around 300 SS troops from the 1st SS Panzer Battalion slipped through the American lines under cover of darkness and reached the hotel's basement, joining the defenders inside. Reinforced, the Germans launched a series of desperate counterattacks, temporarily pushing the Americans back from the immediate vicinity. U.S. forces regrouped and waited for dawn. At first light on October 19th, as the Germans prepared to counterattack again, American mortars unleashed a devastating barrage that obliterated the hotel's surroundings and crushed any hope of relief. With overwhelming firepower and relentless determination, the Americans crushed the last German holdouts. On the morning of October 21st, 1944, after 19 days of unbroken fighting, the guns finally fell silent. At noon, Colonel Gerhard Wilk, the German commander of Aachen, emerged from the basement of the shattered Quellenhof Hotel and surrendered. A white flag was hoisted over the ruins. After nearly 3 weeks of carnage, Aachen, the ancient capital of Charlemagne, the pride of Germany, had fallen. It was the first German city to be captured by the Allies, and its collapse marked the beginning of the end for Hitler's Third Reich. The Battle of Aachen ended in smoke and ruins, a victory paid for in blood on both sides. The U.S. Army suffered over 7,000 casualties, including about 2,000 killed. The 30th Infantry Division alone lost nearly 3,000 men, while the 1st Infantry Division suffered more than 1,300 casualties. The Germans fared no better, over 5,000 killed or wounded, and 5,600 captured. The two divisions defending Aachen were virtually wiped out. The ancient city, once a proud symbol of German heritage, now lay 85% destroyed, buried under rubble and ash. It was one of the fiercest urban battles the U.S. Army fought in all of World War II, rivaling the brutality of the Pacific Front. Both sides came away changed. The Americans learned to respect the Germans' grim determination, while the Germans grudgingly admitted the overwhelming power and coordination of the Allied assault. Strategically, Aachen became the first German city to fall, marking the collapse of the Siegfried Line and the first breach into Hitler's homeland. Yet the tenacious German defense stalled the Allied advance far longer than expected. Instead of pushing deep into the Ruhr, the Americans were forced to pause, regroup, and prepare for the next, even bloodier campaign, the Battle of Hürtgen Forest. Still, Aachen's capture carried immense symbolic weight. For the first time, the American flag flew over German soil, signaling the beginning of the end for the Third Reich. Aachen was more than the fall of a German city. It was the sign that the war had officially crossed into the territory of the Third Reich itself. When Allied forces captured Aachen in the autumn of 1944, Germany's western door had been broken open, and for the first time, Hitler was forced to face the reality that the war was no longer being fought only in occupied lands, but was now moving directly into Germany itself. But Aachen did not mean surrender. Hitler understood that Germany no longer had the strength to win a prolonged war of attrition, and if there was any chance left to change the course of the war, it would require a counteroffensive powerful enough to shake the Western Front, split British and American forces, and force the Allies to slow down. That gamble lay in the Ardennes. In December 1944, amid deep forests, heavy snow, and winter fog, Hitler launched his final major counteroffensive. If Aachen showed that Germany's front door had been forced open, then the Battle of the Bulge would become the last desperate attempt to slam it shut. By late 1944, the war in Europe had tilted decisively in favor of the Allies. After the Normandy landings in June and the liberation of France, British and American forces had pushed to the western borders of Germany. In August, Paris was freed. By September, several Allied spearheads had already crossed into German territory. However, after months of continuous fighting, the pace of the advance slowed. Supply lines were overstretched, troops were exhausted, and key ports such as Antwerp, though captured, could not yet be put to use. Many units, especially American ones, needed to be rotated out for rest, and Allied command believed that the remote Ardennes region, along the Belgium-Luxembourg border, was a safe, low-risk sector unlikely to see major combat. Allied intelligence also assumed that German forces were depleted and incapable of launching a large-scale offensive. In reality, Adolf Hitler was secretly preparing a bold gamble. He believed that only a sudden, powerful strike on the Western Front could change the course of the war. The objective of Wacht am Rhein was to break through the Ardennes, advance rapidly to the Meuse River, seize the port of Antwerp to split the British and American armies, cripple Allied logistics in the north, and force them to negotiate, allowing Nazi Germany to concentrate fully against the Soviet Union. In the depths of a harsh winter, under heavy snow and dense fog, nearly 500,000 German troops, including elite SS Panzer divisions, quietly massed near the American lines. The preparations were kept in total secrecy, ensuring that when the offensive began, it would be the largest and most daring counterattack Germany would launch on the Western Front during World War II. At dawn on December 16, 1944, while the Ardennes forest was still shrouded in the frigid darkness of winter, Nazi Germany suddenly unleashed thousands of artillery pieces, marking the start of a bold offensive. At 5:30 a.m., thunderous explosions shattered the silence, pounding American defensive lines along a 130-kilometer front. Immediately after the intense barrage, 3 German armies, totaling about 250,000 troops, launched their assault, striking at the Allies' exposed positions. On the northern flank, the 6th SS Panzer Army under General Sepp Dietrich advanced toward the Meuse River, aiming to cross at Liège-Huy and capture Antwerp. In the center, the 5th Panzer Army, led by General Hasso von Manteuffel, targeted key transportation hubs such as Bastogne and Saint-Vith before pushing on to Brussels. In the south, the 7th Army under General Erich Brandenberger's command was tasked mainly with protecting the southern flank of the main thrust and preventing the U.S. Third Army under General Patton from counterattacking from that direction. Germany's goal was to break through the thin American defenses in this rugged, forested region, seize the bridges over the Meuse, and drive straight to Antwerp, splitting the British. and American forces and forcing the Allies to negotiate. The plan was kept in absolute secrecy, achieving a devastating surprise. Most U.S. forces in the Ardennes were inexperienced troops or reserve units resting in the sector with low alertness, never expecting Germany to still have the strength for such a massive counterattack, especially in a region the Allies considered safe. Heavy fog and thick winter snow grounded Allied reconnaissance aircraft, allowing Germany to maintain both strategic and tactical surprise. On the very first day, many American outposts were overrun. The Germans employed a deep-thrust, bypass resistance tactic. Panzer spearheads slipping through weak points to push rapidly into the rear, rather than spreading out to eliminate every strong point, cutting off and encircling numerous U.S. units within just 48 hours. On the map, the penetration formed a deep bulge into Allied-held territory, giving the battle its enduring name, the Battle of the Bulge. On the northern flank, Germany's 6th SS Panzer Army committed its most elite units, the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, and the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, under the command of General Joseph Sepp Dietrich. Their objective was to break through the Allied line at the Losheim Gap, a terrain opening on the Belgium-Germany border, and advance to capture the city of Liège. On December 16th, a setback occurred. The parachute battalion of Colonel Friedrich von der Heydte, Operation Stösser, tasked with dropping behind American lines to seize a key crossroads, was scattered by high winds and failed to regroup. Nevertheless, on the ground, the German spearheads initially advanced quickly, overrunning American forward positions. In the village of Lanzerath, a U.S. reconnaissance company fought to the last man, delaying the German vanguard for nearly a full day before being overrun. By December 17th, SS armored spearheads continued to push forward. Special Operations Forces led by Lieutenant Colonel Otto Skorzeny, Operation Greif, also began their mission. About 150 German soldiers, fluent in English and dressed in American uniforms, infiltrated Allied rear areas in captured U.S. vehicles, changing road signs, cutting communication lines, and spreading false information to sow confusion. The chaos grew so severe that American troops began suspecting one another. Even General Omar Bradley, commander of the U.S. 12th Army Group, was stopped at a checkpoint and forced to answer questions about football and actress Betty Grable to prove he was not a disguised German. Although the Germans enjoyed initial surprise, their northern thrust soon met stiff resistance from veteran U.S. units in the rear. The 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions quickly established a defensive line on Elsenborn Ridge, north of the Ardennes. From December 18th to 19th, in the twin villages of Krinkelt and Rocherath, they fiercely repelled multiple German armored assaults. The heavy fighting slowed the 6th SS Panzer Army's advance, forcing General Dietrich to redirect south. But Elsenborn Ridge remained firmly in American hands. This defensive success was strategically decisive. Holding the northern flank prevented the Germans from widening their breakthrough toward the northwest, denied them access to Liège, and kept them from threatening the left wing of the Allied front. Crucially, it also safeguarded important Allied fuel depots, while many German armored units began running out of fuel after failing to capture enemy supplies as planned. In the central sector of the Ardennes, General Hasso von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army struck the area held by the U.S. 8th Corps. Although the terrain here was more difficult, success would open the shortest route to the Meuse River. On December 16th and 17th, German forces pushed through the Ardennes forest, attacking positions of the U.S. 106th Infantry Division on the Schnee-Eifel Plateau. 2 regiments of the division, stationed at Schönberg, were quickly encircled. After 2 days of resistance, more than 6,000 American troops surrendered on December 19th, marking the largest single capture of U.S. soldiers in World War II, second only to the events at Singapore and Bataan, which involved British and Philippine troops. The collapse of part of the 106th Division opened a major gap in the center, allowing German forces to surge forward. However, they did not advance easily everywhere. Some U.S. units of the 8th Corps fought stubbornly to slow the German advance. In the key road junction town of St. Vith, remnants of the 106th joined with the U.S. 7th Armored Division to form a solid defensive position, holding from December 17th to 21st. This battle delayed von Manteuffel's timetable by about 2 to 3 days, giving the Allies precious time to bring in reinforcements. Although St. Vith fell on December 21st, the loss of time had already blunted Germany's initial strategic momentum. On the southern flank, Germany's 7th Army advanced into Luxembourg to protect the left flank of the main thrust. Composed mostly of infantry with lighter equipment, they moved slowly and met fierce resistance from the U.S. 4th Infantry Division near Echternach. Their mission was to tie down General Patton's U.S. Third Army in the south, preventing it from reinforcing the Ardennes, but their slow progress meant they never posed a significant threat. By the third week of December 1944, a massive bulge spanning dozens of kilometers had formed on the Allied front line map, giving the battle its now famous name. Hundreds of villages and small towns in Belgium and Luxembourg fell into German hands in the opening days. Alongside the military offensive, German troops committed serious war crimes. On the afternoon of December 17th, near the Bonnier crossroads outside Malmedy, a unit of the 1st SS Panzer Brigade, under Captain Joachim Peiper, massacred 84 American POWs after they had surrendered, an atrocity known as the Malmedy Massacre. The news spread quickly, strengthening the resolve of Allied soldiers to fight to the death rather than risk capture. Many Belgian civilians were also killed, including 11 African-American artillerymen of the U.S. 333rd Field Artillery Battalion executed near Vereth. These brutal acts underscored the desperation and ruthlessness of Hitler's final counteroffensive on the Western Front. From the very start of the Ardennes offensive, Bastogne became a key objective for both sides. The town sat at the center of the Ardennes, where 7 major roads converged, making it one of the most important transportation hubs in the region. The German plan called for capturing Bastogne within the first 2 days, so that their armored units could exploit the road network to push rapidly westward. The Americans, on the other hand, understood that holding Bastogne could seriously hinder the German advance. Before the attack, Bastogne was defended by elements of the U.S. 28th Infantry Division. On December 19th, recognizing the town's strategic importance amid the chaos, Allied command rushed reinforcements. The famed U.S. 101st Airborne Division, Screaming Eagles, and a parachute brigade from the 82nd Airborne Division. Forced to make a rapid march in freezing winter conditions, these elite units arrived just in time, moments before the Germans sealed the encirclement. By December 20th, Bastogne was completely surrounded. More than 12,000 American troops, under Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st in General Maxwell Taylor's absence, established a defensive perimeter, turning Bastogne into a fortress in the midst of enemy forces. The Germans, particularly armored formations from the 47th Panzer Corps, launched repeated assaults from the east and north. Inside the pocket, the Americans faced increasingly dire conditions: dwindling medical supplies and food, mounting numbers of wounded with insufficient care, and bitter cold, causing frostbite among the troops. By December 22nd, artillery ammunition was so scarce that each gun could fire only a few shells per day. That same day, German commander Heinrich Freiherr von Leutwitz sent a formal ultimatum demanding unconditional surrender, threatening total destruction if refused. McAuliffe's reply was a single word: nuts, American slang expressing outright contempt, essentially meaning "Go to hell." When the German delegation asked for clarification, the Americans politely explained the insult. The defiant response quickly became legendary, boosting the defenders' morale. Bastogne remained under siege throughout Christmas week of 1944. The 101st Airborne, supported by elements including the U.S. 10th Armored Division and artillery battalions, maintained a tight defensive ring, repelling multiple German armor thrusts. Dozens of enemy tanks were destroyed on the outskirts. On the night of December 24th, the Germans launched a major assault intended to crush the town, initially breaking through the western defenses but soon being counterattacked and thrown back, with all lead tanks destroyed. Bastogne's determined stand tied down forces far larger than its own, preventing Manteuffel's army from exploiting the vital road junction for supply and maneuver. Late on December 24th, realizing the stalemate, Manteufel requested permission from German High Command to halt the assault and withdraw, but Hitler in Berlin flatly refused, ordering the attack to continue at all costs. While Bastogne remained under tight siege, an unexpected factor began to shift the balance of the battlefield: the weather. On December 23, 1944, skies began to clear, fog lifted, and snowfall ceased. The Allies immediately seized the opportunity to regain control of the air. Hundreds of B-26 Marauder and B-17 Flying Fortress bombers pounded German supply depots and logistical convoys behind the front. Squadrons of P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers roamed the skies, strafing German tanks and motorized columns along the narrow roads through the Ardennes forest. The return of Allied air power played a decisive role in halting the German advance. Many armored convoys were destroyed, forced to hide, or left stranded due to fuel shortages and fear of air attacks. At the same time, Allied transport aircraft began massive airdrops to resupply Bastogne. In the final days of December, dozens of C-47 Dakota sorties flew over the encircled town, parachuting hundreds of tons of supplies, food, medicine, blankets, and most critically, ammunition that was worth its weight in gold to the defenders. A team of American doctors and medics even volunteered to accompany glider missions, landing under enemy fire to perform surgeries and treat the wounded in makeshift conditions. The clear skies brought renewed hope to Bastogne. Meanwhile, Allied High Command was urgently preparing a counterstroke. In Verdun, General Dwight D. Eisenhower convened an emergency meeting with senior commanders and decided that General George S. Patton would wheel his U.S. Third Army from Lorraine in the south northward to relieve Bastogne. In the north of the Bulge, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commander of the British-Canadian 21st Army Group, temporarily took over U.S. units in the northern Ardennes, organizing defensive positions and preparing to attack southward. Eisenhower's order was clear: seal off that Bulge. A simultaneous two-pronged assault from north and south to meet in the middle, cutting off German forces deep inside the Ardennes. On the German side, Hitler pushed for one final effort. He ordered the launch of Operation Bodenplatte on the morning of January 1, 1945, a massive Luftwaffe strike aimed at destroying Allied air forces based in the Netherlands and Belgium. Hundreds of German fighters and fighter bombers struck Allied airfields on New Year's Day, destroying or damaging around 465 Allied aircraft on the ground. However, this knockout blow failed to yield lasting results. The Allies replaced their losses within days, while the Luftwaffe lost 277 aircraft and many experienced pilots, men they could no longer replace. That same day, the Germans also launched Operation Nordwind, North Wind, attacking U.S. forces in Alsace in hopes of diverting Allied attention from the Ardennes. But with their strength already spent, the offensive was halted after a few weeks, inflicting heavy losses on Germany without achieving any significant strategic gains. These belated efforts showed that Hitler was running out of options, and the Ardennes gamble was beginning to slip from his grasp. Amid the siege of Bastogne, The clatter of tank tracks thundered from the southern edge of the town. They were not German, but the U.S. 4th Armored Division under General George S. Patton, arriving in time to break the encirclement. At 4:50 p.m., the M4 Sherman tank, numbered D-31 from Company D, 37th Tank Battalion, part of the 4th Armored Division, commanded by Lieutenant Charles Boggess, smashed through roadblocks and entered the village of Assenois on Bastogne's southern edge, linking up with paratroopers of the 101st Airborne. The siege of Bastogne was officially lifted. The defenders erupted with joy at the sight of the relief force. Many wept and embraced comrades who had fought their way through. The vital supply route connecting Bastogne to the Allied lines in the south was reopened, allowing the evacuation of wounded and the influx of much-needed supplies. This event marked a major turning point in the Battle of the Ardennes. From this moment, the Germans lost their strategic advantage, and the Allies regained the initiative. Although the siege was broken, Bastogne still lay on the front lines, and the fighting around it did not cease. The Germans launched furious counterattacks to try to seal the gap once more. From late December into early January, intense battles raged on the town's outskirts. On January 2nd, 1945, the German 506th Heavy Panzer Battalion deployed its formidable Panzer VI King Tiger tanks in an ambush against U.S. 6th Armored Division near Bastogne, destroying 15 Sherman tanks. Yet this effort failed to alter the overall situation. On January 7, 1945, Hitler was forced to acknowledge the failure of the Ardennes offensive and approved a gradual withdrawal to avoid encirclement. German forces began pulling back from their deepest salients, fighting hard to delay the Allies and protect retreating units. By this time, the Allies had concentrated overwhelming strength to counterattack and close the Ardennes Bulge. From the north, the British-Canadian 21st Army Group under Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery advanced south. From the south, Patton's U.S. Third Army pushed north. The plan was for the two forces to meet at the town of Houffalize, at the center of the Bulge, to encircle the remaining German troops. On January 3, 1945, Montgomery ordered the attack as the Germans began pulling back. Harsh winter conditions with deep snow and ice severely slowed the Allied advance, often to barely half a mile per day. It was not until January 16, 1945, that U.S. forces from the south, 11th Armored Division, and British-American forces from the north, U.S. 84th Infantry Division and British reconnaissance units, linked up at Houffalize, officially closing the mouth of the Bulge. Most of the German forces escaped before the encirclement was complete, but they were forced to abandon the majority of their tanks, heavy artillery, and vehicles along the retreat routes. In January 1945, near Wiltz, Luxembourg, soldiers of Company B, 101st Engineer Battalion, U.S. Army, snatched a brief rest after holding their positions through the night in the forest. The Battle of the Bulge took place during one of the harshest European winters on record, with temperatures dropping as low as -20 degrees Celsius, -4 degrees Fahrenheit, forcing soldiers on both sides to endure extreme hardship. Many suffered frostbite. Vehicles had to be started every half hour to prevent engine oil from freezing. Weapons and ammunition frequently malfunctioned in the icy conditions. Despite the brutal weather, both the Allies and the Germans were compelled to keep fighting, attacking at all costs in the bitter cold. The freezing temperatures and rugged, forested terrain became a natural enemy as formidable as the opposing army's firepower. After the Ardennes Bulge was closed, Allied forces gradually pushed the Germans back to their original start lines. The German withdrawal was orderly, with rearguard actions at strong points to slow the Allied advance. However, by this stage, the Allies held complete superiority in manpower and air power. By the end of January 1945, the last towns captured by the Germans in their offensive, such as St. Vith and Echternach, were retaken. On January 23rd, St. Vith, which had fallen on December 21st, was recaptured by U.S. forces. On January 25, 1945, Allied High Command officially declared the Ardennes campaign over, with the Western Front restored to nearly the same positions as before December 16, 1944. Hitler's desperate winter counteroffensive had been decisively broken. The Ardennes offensive, or the Battle of the Bulge, is remembered as the bloodiest battle fought by the U.S. Army in World War II. The Allies deployed over 700,000 troops, with American forces suffering around 77,000 to 81,000 casualties, including more than 19,000 killed. The highest U.S. death toll in any single battle of World War II. Germany committed roughly 400,000 troops and lost between 63,000 and 100,000 men, along with most of its remaining tanks, artillery, and aircraft on the Western Front, losses that could not be replaced as its war industry was already on the brink of collapse. The defeat forced Germany's elite armored divisions to retreat hastily behind the Siegfried Line, leaving them incapable of mounting any further large-scale counteroffensive. This desperate winter gamble drained the Wehrmacht's last strategic reserves, destroying hundreds of its most modern tanks and aircraft, and exhausting its finest combat troops, all of which Germany could no longer replenish. As a result, just weeks later, in February 1945, the Soviet Union launched a massive offensive on the Eastern Front, while in March, British and American forces crossed the Rhine and pushed into the German heartland. Less than 4 months after the Ardennes, the war in Europe ended with Nazi Germany's total defeat. For the Allies, this was not only a strategic triumph, but also proof of resilience and unity. Despite being caught off guard, key positions like Bastogne, St. Vith, and Elsenborn Ridge held firm, slowing and ultimately breaking the enemy's main thrust. Coordination among Allied commanders, despite personal frictions, delivered a decisive result. As British Prime Minister Winston Churchill declared, "This was the greatest American battle of the war, a victory that will be remembered as one of the most glorious in U.S. history, flinging open the gates to Germany, ending Hitler's last gamble, and sealing the fate of the Third Reich." The Battle of the Bulge was Hitler's final great gamble on the Western Front. And when it failed, Germany had little left to wager. The Ardennes offensive burned through the last precious reserves of armor, fuel, and manpower that the Third Reich still possessed, yet it failed to reverse the course of the war. When that counteroffensive collapsed, Germany's last real hope of halting the Allied advance in the West collapsed with it. But by early 1945, the threat no longer came from one direction alone. While British and American forces continued pressing from the west, the Soviet Red Army was advancing from the east with overwhelming momentum. After years of fighting a two-front war, Germany was now being compressed from both sides, its territory shrinking, its defenses steadily breaking apart. From that point on, the question was no longer whether the Third Reich would fall. It was when the war would end in Berlin. April 1945. Europe was sinking into the final days of the Second World War. In Berlin, the heart of the Nazi Reich, the sky was thick with smoke and fire, the city already devastated after nearly 6 years of unrelenting war. Germany's industrial and economic machine had collapsed. Cities lay in ruins under relentless bombing, food was scarce, and fuel was nearly gone. On both fronts, German forces were retreating before the overwhelming pressure of the Allies. In the West, Anglo-American troops had crossed the Rhine and driven deep into German territory. In the East, the Red Army swept through Eastern Europe, closing in on the German border. By early February 1945, Marshal Georgy Zhukov's First Belarusian Front had reached the Oder River, just 70 kilometers from Berlin. Inside his bunker in Berlin, Adolf Hitler still clung to the illusion of a miracle that could turn the tide. He believed that by prolonging resistance, the Reich might survive through cracks in the Allied coalition or by deploying so-called wonder weapons. In desperation, he ordered the capital to be defended to the last man, mobilizing even teenagers and the elderly into the Volkssturm militia. Berlin was transformed into a fortress, with multiple defensive belts stretching from the outer approaches to the city's very center. For the Soviets, Berlin was the ultimate strategic objective. After liberating Poland and securing bridgeheads on the Oder, the Red Army paused to concentrate its forces for the decisive blow. Through February and March, Soviet offensives eliminated remaining German forces in East Prussia, East Pomerania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Austria, securing both flanks before turning all strength against the Reich's capital. By mid-April, the Soviets had massed an enormous force around Berlin. Over 2 million troops, 6,250 tanks, 7,500 aircraft, and more than 40,000 artillery pieces. Three major fronts converged. Zhukov's First Belarusian Front striking head-on from the east, Marshal Ivan Konev's First Ukrainian Front driving in from the south, and Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky's Second Belarusian Front pressing from the north. They were supported by the Baltic Fleet, the Dnieper River Flotilla, Soviet air armies, and even Polish formations. Zhukov later wrote that their intent was to deliver a thunderous blow that would stun the enemy, shaking him to his very roots. On the German side, preparations for the defense of the capital were frantic. Roughly 800,000 men, from Army Group Vistula in the east, Army Group Center in the south, reinforced by SS units, police, and the Volkssturm, were thrown into the line. Yet the disparity in strength was immense. In manpower and aircraft, they had barely half of what the Soviets could field, and in tanks and artillery only a quarter. Their main hope lay in a layered defense along the Oder and around Berlin, with the Seelow Heights forming the most critical position. Guarding the shortest route to the capital, the Seelow Heights, known as the Gateway to Berlin, were defended by General Gotthard Heinrizi's Ninth Army, with 110,000 men entrenched in bunkers, trenches, minefields, and obstacles. Dense belts of anti-aircraft flak guns and field artillery created a wall of fire. Though morale was crumbling, German troops were driven by propaganda to fight for the homeland. Everything pointed to an imminent and catastrophic final battle. At dawn on April 16, 1945, the Soviet assault on Berlin began in full force. After a massive artillery barrage with tens of thousands of guns pounding the front, Soviet forces surged across the Oder and Neisse rivers, launching their attack on the German defensive lines. On the main axis, Marshal Georgy Zhukov's First Belarusian Front sent waves of tanks and infantry crashing into the Seelow Heights. As the sky lightened, hundreds of powerful searchlights positioned behind the Red Army cut through the mist, aimed at dazzling the German defenders. But the heavy morning fog and swirling battlefield smoke scattered the beams, backlighting the Soviet troops instead and exposing them to German fire. From the high ground, German artillery and machine guns unleashed a storm of fire on the first assault waves, inflicting heavy losses. Soviet tanks struck mines and were ripped apart by anti-tank fire, burning along the slopes as the defense roared to life. Despite the fierce resistance, the Red Army pressed on, steadily suppressing German strongpoints. Soviet engineers risked their lives clearing mines and obstacles, while 203mm heavy guns fired directly at reinforced bunkers. After 3 days of brutal fighting, on April 19th, the German defenses at Seelow finally collapsed. The gateway to Berlin was forced open. Roughly 210,000 German soldiers fled the shattered line, only to be encircled by Soviet pincers in the Halbe forest south of the capital. Over the following 2 weeks, more than 90% of these trapped forces were either destroyed or captured. At the same time, in Italy and Western Europe, German positions were also crumbling under relentless Allied advances. The Third Reich's days were clearly numbered. On April 20th, 1945, Soviet long-range artillery began shelling central Berlin, a bitter birthday present for Adolf Hitler as he turned 56. That same day, Zhukov's spearhead tanks pressed into the northern and eastern suburbs, while Konev's forces smashed through Army Group Center's lines and surged into the southern approaches of the city. In Moscow, Joseph Stalin closely monitored the offensive, urging his marshals to move faster. He officially tasked Zhukov with capturing Berlin, but also quietly encouraged Konev to compete, sparking a rivalry over who would be the first to plant the red banner in the enemy's heart. Inside Berlin, panic spread. Civilians abandoned their homes, huddling in deep shelters or desperately seeking escape from the city. The thunder of Soviet guns grew louder with each passing hour, sapping the morale of soldiers and citizens alike. On April 22nd, deep in his underground Führer bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, Hitler finally admitted to his generals that the war was lost. Upon hearing that General Felix Steiner's forces, which he had ordered to counterattack and relieve Berlin, no longer had the strength to act, he flew into a rage. Still, he vowed to remain in the capital and die with Berlin, while dismissing commanders he deemed disloyal. In the chaos, General Helmuth Weidling was appointed commander of the city's defense, tasked with organizing the remaining fragmented forces for a final stand. On April 24, 1945, the Soviet spearheads from the south and east linked up on the outskirts of Berlin, completing the encirclement of the German outer defenses. By April 25th, the ring was sealed entirely when Zhukov's 1st Belarusian front joined hands with Konev's 1st Ukrainian front near Ketsin, west of the capital. That same day, over 100 kilometers south of Berlin, another historic encounter took place. Soviet troops and American soldiers met at the Elbe River Bridge in Torgau. The meeting of the two Allied armies, one advancing from the east, the other from the west, cut Germany in half and sent an unmistakable message. Every road of reinforcement to Berlin had been blocked. Inside the city, an estimated 200,000 German soldiers, SS units, and Volkssturm militia were trapped with no way out. Their stubborn defense could only buy a little more time, not alter the inevitable outcome. With the encirclement secured, the Red Army launched its full-scale assault into the heart of Berlin. Soviet forces fought street by street, deploying shock infantry backed closely by tanks, artillery, and combat engineers. Every solid building was treated as a fortress to be captured or destroyed. The Germans had prepared for this. High-rises and government buildings were turned into strong points, while the underground network of subways and sewers allowed troops to move unseen, launching surprise attacks against the Soviets' rear. Suicide squads appeared everywhere, firing suddenly before vanishing like phantoms into the ruined city. From rooftops and upper floors, German defenders set up machine guns, sniper nests, and even heavy anti-aircraft guns of 88mm and 128mm caliber, using direct fire against ground targets. Soldiers and civilians alike carried Panzerfaust anti-tank launchers, weapons so simple that even teenage Hitler youth could destroy a Soviet tank at close range. Nearly 2,000 Soviet tanks and armored vehicles were lost in the streets of Berlin to such ambushes. Faced with these threats, Soviet tank crews advanced slowly, hugging building walls to shield their flanks. As Red Army gunner Ivan Maslov recalled, any tank moving down the middle of the street was quickly set ablaze. Every intersection, every house turned into a battlefield. The German defenders were split into isolated pockets, cut off from communication or support. To crush these strong points, Soviet units broke into small assault groups, surrounding and isolating targets before leveling them with concentrated firepower. Infantry moved in lockstep with tanks, supported by mobile artillery to suppress snipers and Panzerfaust teams above. When faced with machine gun nests buried in basements or bunkers, Soviet engineers placed explosives to bring entire buildings down. The Germans resisted with desperation, but as ammunition ran out, their fate was sealed. Annihilation or surrender. By the end of April 1945, the fighting had narrowed to the very center of Berlin, where the last command posts of the Nazi regime were located. On April 28th, German High Command received devastating news. Heinrich Himmler, the notorious SS chief and Hitler's most trusted lieutenant, had secretly sent envoys to negotiate a separate surrender with the British and Americans. The report, broadcast by BBC London, struck Hitler like a dagger in the back. Shaken and betrayed, he sank into despair, convinced that everything was collapsing. Outside, the German defense shrank into an ever-tightening pocket. From April 29th, the remnants of the garrison, mostly die-hard SS units, pulled back to defend the Reichstag and the Reich Chancellery, where Hitler's underground bunker was located. The city center had become a smoking wasteland. Palaces and museums lay in ruins, grand boulevards were littered with blackened tank carcasses, and the acrid stench of gunpowder mixed with the smell of death. Beneath the rubble, in the suffocating confines of the Führer bunker, Hitler and his reduced staff lived out the final hours of the Reich. On April 29th, he hastily married Eva Braun, then drafted his last will and testament. In it, he stubbornly refused to admit defeat, appointing Admiral Karl Dönitz as president and propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels as chancellor. He also ordered that his body be burned after death to avoid the humiliation of capture at the hands of the enemy. At midday on April 29th, the final assault on the Reichstag began. Soviet artillery and airstrikes battered the city center before Red Army shock troops stormed the iconic building. Inside, over 5,000 German defenders, mostly SS, fought to the last, contesting every corridor, stairwell, and chamber. Soviet 152mm and 203mm guns blasted holes in the walls for infantry to pour through. But the Germans clung to basements and darkened rooms, launching counterattacks that briefly pushed the attackers back. From flak towers a few kilometers away, 128mm guns poured supporting fire into the embattled stronghold. For 2 days, the battle raged hand to hand, blood staining every stairway and hall. By late afternoon on April 30th, Soviet storm groups finally broke through to the roof. At 9:50 p.m., soldiers Mikhail Igorov and Meleton Kantaria raised the red banner with hammer and sickle atop the Reichstag dome. The image of the flag flying over the shattered building became the immortal symbol of victory over Nazi Germany. At the same time, deep in his bunker, Adolf Hitler faced the inevitable. That afternoon, after learning that Berlin's defenders could hold out no longer than a single day due to lack of ammunition, he withdrew with Eva Braun to his private quarters. Eva took cyanide, and Hitler shot himself in the head with his pistol, ending his life in bitterness and disgrace. Their bodies were carried up to the garden of the Reich Chancellery and burned, as per his final orders. The man who had once boasted that his Reich would last 1,000 years had ruled for only 12, his empire collapsing in flames and ruin in the heart of the capital. At dawn on May 1st, 1945, the guns in central Berlin briefly fell silent. General Hans Krebs, chief of the German Army General Staff and newly appointed envoy of President Karl Dönitz, stepped forward under a white flag. He made his way to the headquarters of the Soviet 8th Guards Army, seeking negotiations in the hope of saving what remained of German forces. In the Soviet command post, Krebs announced that Hitler was dead and requested a ceasefire. Marshal Zhukov, however, made it clear only unconditional surrender would be accepted. Lacking the authority to agree, Krebs left in vain. Soon after, the fighting flared up once more. That night, May 1st, the last German strong points around the Reichstag and the Reich Chancellery shuddered under new Soviet artillery barrages. Across the streets, shattered German troops tried to slip through the ruins to escape, but most were captured or cut down in scattered skirmishes. Before Soviet troops stormed the Chancellery, Propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's designated successor, and his wife murdered their 6 young children and then took their own lives, sealing one of the darkest chapters of the Nazi regime. By the early hours of May 2nd, 1945, all was silent in Berlin. Recognizing that further resistance was futile, General Helmuth Weidling, commander of the city's defense, ordered a full and unconditional surrender. At 6 a.m., from every direction, groups of German soldiers emerged from bunkers, raising white flags or scraps of cloth in surrender. Exhausted, dirt-streaked and blood-stained, their hands still trembled from days of desperate combat. They stumbled through a city in ruins, where not a single building stood intact in the center, where burnt-out tanks and vehicles lay scattered and streets were buried under rubble. Survivors among the Berlin populace emerged from their shelters, silently watching the defeated soldiers being led away. Many broke into tears, realizing the nightmare had finally ended. Above the Reichstag, the Soviet red banner still flew proudly. In front of the building, war photographer Yevgeny Kaldey captured the iconic moment a Red Army soldier raised the victory flag against the Berlin sky, an image that would forever symbolize the great triumph over fascism. The Battle of Berlin in 1945, the final and decisive clash of the war in Europe, ended amidst smoke, rubble, and devastation. The cost of victory was staggering. In less than 3 weeks, around 100,000 German soldiers were killed or went missing, and nearly 500,000 were taken prisoner. On the Soviet side, victory came at the price of approximately 80,000 soldiers killed and nearly 300,000 wounded. Meanwhile, nearly 2.2 million civilians in Berlin and the surrounding areas suffered immense tragedy. The city lay in ruins, homes were destroyed, and more than 20,000 innocent people lost their lives in the final battle forced upon them by the Nazi regime. Militarily, the Red Army annihilated 70 German infantry divisions and 23 armored divisions, virtually the last of Nazi Germany's main forces. With the fall of Berlin, the Third Reich collapsed beyond salvation. On May 7, 1945, in Reims, France, representatives of the German High Command were forced to sign an instrument of unconditional surrender to the Allies. At the Soviet Union's insistence, a second formal signing took place in Berlin on the night of May 8th, the early hours of May 9th Moscow time, witnessed by Marshal Georgy Zhukov and Allied commanders. Since then, May 9th, 1945, has been remembered as the final end of World War II in Europe, a date still commemorated in Russia and former Soviet states as Victory Day. The guns had fallen silent. 6 years of bloodshed came to a close, giving way to a fragile yet hopeful peace across a continent scarred by immense suffering. Berlin itself stood as a symbol of both ultimate destruction and liberation. In the memory of humanity, the Battle of Berlin will forever be recalled as a tragic yet heroic epic, the bloody but inevitable conclusion of Nazi Germany, and the defining moment that marked the complete victory of the Allied forces in the most brutal war against fascism the world had ever known. It was not only the fall of a tyrannical regime, but also the beginning of reconstruction and the shaping of a new international order, one built on the hope that humanity could learn from these hard-won lessons to prevent such a catastrophe from happening again. From Stalingrad to Berlin, Nazi Germany did not collapse because it lost a single battle. It was broken apart stage by stage, campaign by campaign, front by front. Stalingrad shattered the myth of invincibility. Kursk destroyed Germany's ability to regain strategic initiative in the east. Normandy blew open the door to Western Europe. Aachen brought the war onto German soil itself. The Ardennes became the final desperate gamble that failed. And Berlin was where the entire Reich ended, beneath the ruins of the very ambition that had created it. This was not simply a sequence of Europe's greatest battles in World War II. It was the process by which a war machine that had once conquered nearly an entire continent was crushed by attrition, industry, strategy, and irreversible mistakes. 3 years earlier, the Wehrmacht had marched east believing it could reshape the world. 3 years later, the Red Army raised its flag over the Reichstag, while the Western Allies closed in from the other side, and the Third Reich disappeared. From the Volga through Kursk, Normandy, Aachen, the Ardennes, to Berlin, the war in Europe did not end in one single moment, but through the total collapse of an empire that had set the world on fire. And when the final guns fell silent in the ruins of Berlin in 1945, what collapsed was not only Nazi Germany, it was the illusion that a war of conquest could endure forever.